Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is all roads lead to Denerim in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. 101 Crow watching. Zevran was up to something. It was in the furtive way he studied Alistair. It was in the way he smiled mysteriously whenever Finn caught him at it. It was in his words and his silences. The assassin was up to something. At first, Finian had been merely curious. Zevran was often inexplicable, as far as Finn was concerned. That was part of what made him exciting. But it went on for days, and Finian couldn't shake the feeling that, whatever he was up to, it had something to do with himself. If it was just some sort of game, the Antivan would have let him in on it by now. The party worked their way down the mountain, their progress achingly slow because of the injured Chantry scholar they were escorting back. They had refused to leave the man alone on top of a mountain, as he'd wanted. It was the least they could do to bring him back to Redcliffe, where he might hitch a ride home to Denerim. It did mean they had to move slowly and take breaks often, though, and Finian got a taste of what the trip from Ostagar to Lothering must have been like for everyone else. Back then, he'd been the injured one. Not that he wasn't injured now. It was hard to keep a cheerful face on everything, despite their success with the ashes, now safely stowed in Alistair's pouch. His throat hadn't healed from the fight with the dragon, and small surprise, he'd swallowed dragon fire. It was a fight he couldn't regret. When else would he ever get the chance to ride a dragon? But the loss of his voice was a bit steeper payment than was fair. But he couldn't show the others how much it bothered him, so he kept his disposition calm and cheerful. They stopped at midday about halfway down the mountain from Haven, once again settling onto the side of the path so that Genevieve could rest on a boulder. Finn settled onto a fallen log nearby, taking out his loot to occupy himself while the others bantered, and Fang circled around their camp protectively. Sure enough, Alistair turned a look on the Antivan. "Is there something I can help you with, Zevran? Or are you just going to stare at my posterior all day?" Well, now that you mention it, the latter option does seem the better, yes. No. Leliana giggled. Better you than me, no. Win. No, Alistair. I'm not getting involved in this one. The elderly mage settled on the boulder beside Genevieve. Zevran gave a sigh. Obviously, we have many issues to work out among us. I think we must go back up the mountain and face the gauntlet again. And let us be particularly thorough about walking through that fire, yes. When Zevran flashed Finn a wink from across the clearing, Finian cast him a playful smile, but he found he couldn't feel it. It bothered him, seeing Zevran flirt like this. He'd never minded before, but there was something different now that made Finn ache just a little bit every time the assassin flashed that smile at someone else. Was Zevran getting more aggressive in his flirtations? Was it the fact that Finn couldn't join in, with his voice destroyed? Or was it the fact that he worried that Alistair's strong, golden good looks or Leliana's sweet charms might lure his Zevran away? His Zevran. That was the problem. In truth, he had no claim over the Antivan. Their relationship had always been one of convenience, Finian releasing tension caused by his yearning for Percival, and Zevran ingratiating himself with the only warden who could walk beside him without constantly checking over his shoulder for a dagger in the back. Except, it hadn't been about Percival for a long time, now. He kept coming back to the assassin for his own sake, because Zevran was fun, and handsome, and a talented lover, and just complex enough to intrigue a people-watcher like Finn. The pickpocket had gone and become attached. And now this dagger of his own making was stabbing him in the back, because Zevran had slowly but surely wheedled his way into the hearts of their companions, earning their trust through his loyalty and his wit. And that meant Zev no longer needed to keep himself attached to Finian as a matter of protection. It was only a matter of time before Zevran realized that, and started questing out. And so it was that every time Zevran flirted, Finn felt a discordant note ring in his head. But he had to keep smiling and laughing along, because otherwise Zevran would detect his attachment, and go running in the other direction all the faster. That night, Zevran didn't follow Finn into his tent as he usually did, and Finian could only figure that the assassin had finally realized it. He smiled to himself as he shucked off his dusty clothing and curled up into his bedroll. At least it had been a fun run, right? With a heavy heart, he blew out his candle, falling asleep to the sound of the rest of the camp settling in for the night. He was roused some time later, as someone slipped smoothly into his tent. Finn jerked up in bed, instantly recognizing that cat-like grace. Zevran pressed a finger to Finn's lips, as if the latter were capable of more than squeaking a greeting. In the dim light, Finian thought he could make out a mischievous smile. "I have a surprise for you, my warden. Forgive me that it took so long, you are, admittedly, a far better pickpocket than I." Finn was confused, and reached for his taper to figure out what in the fade the other elf was talking about. However, Zevran's hand on his stilled him, and he instead felt a half-full water skin pressed into his hand. "What are you dash?" he whispered, even that making his throat burn. "Hush, Amor. Don't speak, just drink." This was all very perplexing, the assassin's intensity entirely out of character. Finn spent a moment studying what he could see of Zevran's face in the dim light leaking through the tent walls. Zevran's eyes were bright with both anticipation and anxiety. Finn gave his lover a smile, and dutifully raised the water skin to his lips. It was filled with water. He'd expected a potion or something, given the elf's insistence that he drink, but instead merely got a couple mouthfuls of water. Not very clean water, either, there was a chalky taste to it. When Finn lowered the water skin, Zevran watched him so anxiously that Finn had to smile. He cleared his throat and teased, "Is this the part where you inform me that it was all a trick, and now you're assassinating me after all?" Then, he froze, and Zevran's face split into a victorious grin. Finian raised a hand to his throat, realizing that there was no pain. "Gone, just like that. And to think that I never did put much stock in miracles," Zevran said. Finian smiled back, realizing what his lover had done. "You think it's maybe time to start?" And his voice was as strong and smooth as ever. "Perhaps," Zevran purred, and Finn chuckled as the Antivan leaned forward to kiss his throat. "But then again, if these are indeed the ashes of the Maker's bride, would it truly have been so easy for me to sneak a pinch away from Alistair for my own selfish ends?" Finn fought down a laugh, delighted and amazed, and, admittedly, relieved, that Zevran had done this for him. "How is curing my voice selfish on your part?" "Simple, my dear." Zevran moved downward and lapped at his clavicle, and the pickpocket released a surprised moan. There it is." "Yes, rest assured, it was entirely selfish." Finian fairly giggled, wrapping his arms around his lover. "In that case, you've been a very naughty crow, stealing a holy substance in the dead of night." Zevran hummed his approval. "Going to punish me, my warden?" Finn moved so that his lips hovered over Zevran's. "Someone has to. In that case, Amor, I am glad it is you." 102 A Tale of Two Maleficarum. It had been a rough couple of weeks rebuilding Red Cliff, but Jowan wasn't going to complain. They had needed all the free hands they could get for the cleanup, so they hadn't forced him back into his cell yet, pending good behavior. Sure, he had to endure a guardsman following him around at all times, but he'd grown up in the Circle Tower, and so this wasn't anything new. Not being allowed in the same room as Connor was a bit tougher. Jowan worried, sometimes, that they were just letting the child roam the castle freely, undertrained as he was. No matter how many times he tried to explain, Tegan just didn't seem to grasp that it was the boy's lack of training that made him susceptible to demons, not necessarily Jowan's influence. But blood magic was contagious. Apparently. And that meant he had to pick up and leave any room that Connor walked into, or else his guard would run and tell Tegan, and he'd be thrown back into his cell. He was, however, trusted with the care of Eamon, a fact he found ironic. It was largely because he was tower-trained, which meant he knew enough herbalism to keep the comatose man clean and pain-free. Maybe they figured that caring for an invalid was a duty befitting a Maleficar? That's where he was when the wardens returned, anyway, washing the old man's bedpan under the watchful eye of his guard. That was when the door opened and Felicity Amel walked into the room. The woman paused when she saw Jowan, and he did the same. He'd never known her all that well at the Circle, despite being of similar age and sharing a lot of classes. He'd always been a bit jealous of her ability to grasp every single lesson set before her, to be honest. "Jowan," she said in greeting, and he was surprised that her voice lacked the hostility it had held against him when she had left. "Felicity," he returned uncertainly. "When did you get back?" "About 10 minutes ago." She stepped more fully into the room, digging through her bag as she came to Eamon's bedside. She, like Jowan, didn't seem to mind the guard. Felicity settled on the opposite side of the bed, ignoring Jowan as she pulled a couple bottles from her bag. Then, she leaned over Eamon and started checking his vital signs. Jowan swallowed. "Are the others with you?" She glanced over at him, like an afterthought. "Yes. Tegan was pulling them into his office when I left. I thought it more prudent to check on Eamon." She turned her attention back to the comatose man. "Has there been any change?" "None. I've been keeping him going, but he's never so much as twitched to show any improvement." Felicity nodded. "Then we will have to hope the others find the ashes." Jowan fidgeted for a moment, his stomach twisting in knots. Then, he stood. Excuse me?" He rushed out of the room, his guard following at his heels. The Arl's room was at the very back of the castle's second floor, which meant that Jowan passed several people on the long trek toward the entrance. As he passed one group of retainers, he heard an old woman who had been there during the siege mutter, "Just so tragic, to lose one of the few wardens we have left." Jowan's stomach twisted further. They'd lost a warden? As in, one had died? Oh Maker, who? Jowan stopped outside the Arl's office, straightening his robes. Then, he cracked the door open and poked his head in. Tegan was speaking. "Attacked our men just north of the Banorn. We need to act soon, whether Eamon can be roused or not. Loghain's directed actual men against us." The Cowsland man asked. He paced, and the other wardens respectfully gave him plenty of room to do so. Jowan didn't blame them. Cowsland was scary. "Do we know who contributed men on either side?" Tegan nodded. "I suppose it shouldn't surprise you that Amaranthin has been pivotal in quashing resistance to Loghain's regency." Cuslin's fists clenched. "That does not surprise me, no." While they spoke, Jowan did a head count, but he didn't know anyone else in the room, save the Maberry. There was a red-headed dwarf, an underdressed woman, and a Cunary Maker. But no elven mages. Howe detected the warden's interest in Eamon, and tried to march on Red Cliff. However, South Reach blocked his forces before he could pass the Banorn. Arl Bryland has been staunch in his support of our side. He's a good man. My father always spoke highly of him. From what I've heard, you're far more familiar with his daughter. Don't, Tegan." The room fell quiet at the man's growl, and Jowan cleared his throat quietly. Cowsland spun on him, and Jowan flinched. Hello. You." The warden was upon him in an instant. Jowan yelped as Cowsland hauled him up by the collar and slammed against a wall. The mage clutched at the man's steel fist, his feet dangling 6 inches above the ground. "Did you know?" The warden growled, and Jowan was not for the first time struck by how similar the man was to the Maberry he prized so much. "Know what?" he squeaked. "Blood magic. Khazar. Did you know?" "Oh no, they'd found out. They'd killed Khazar, and that was why he wasn't here, and now they were going to kill Jowan." "Yes." Cuslin's grip tightened. "When?" Cowsland slammed him back against the wall, and Jowan thought that the warden really would kill him. "When, Jowan?" "I don't know." Cuslin's fist tightened as if to slam him back again. "I think it was during the siege." "Connor's demon." "What?" Tegan gasped. Cuslin's hand pressed into his throat, and Jowan sputtered. "You're saying Khazar learned blood magic from Connor's demon?" "Yes. I think so." He choked out. He couldn't breathe. "Easy, Captain." That rumbling voice was from a shadow to one side, and Jowan jumped to realize there was another dwarf there. "Don't wanna break him, do ya?" Cowsland let go, and Jowan dropped, leaning back against the wall to keep his feet. Cowsland loomed over him. "What deal did he strike?" "I don't know, honest." The warden turned to Tegan. "Has Connor been acting strangely? Is the demon still there?" The noble shook his head. "As far as I can tell, the boy is entirely back to normal. As normal as expected given the loss of his mother, anyway. If you wanna know, boss, just ask the elf." Just walk up and ask him nicely, should I? Kausland snapped. "'Twould certainly be amusing to watch you try," the woman hummed. And Jowan was too relieved to hear that Khazar was apparently still alive to guard his mouth. "I could ask him." Kausland and Tegan both snapped suspicious eyes to him, but the darker dwarf chuckled. "There, see? No problem. Garrot, you obviously don't know who this is. Jowan, right? The kid's best and only friend since he was 4. Kausland stared at him, and the dwarf smirked. "Turns out, the kid does more than spit and glare, if you just sit down to talk to him once in a while." Jowan nodded. Everyone at the circle had always wondered what Jowan saw in Khazar, but this here was a guy who got it. "I'm worried about him. He jumps into things too fast. I promise, if I can figure out what he did, I'll tell you right away." Kausland stared at him for a long time, and then nodded, and Jowan wondered when the man had become so commanding. "Very well. Last I knew, he was heading up to the ramparts." Jowan nodded and, just to be sure, bowed as he left. He skittered out of the room, bumping into his guard as he went. Then, with his armored follower in tow, he started toward the stairs up to the castle walls. Sure enough, he found Khazar on the castle walls, overlooking Lake Callanhood in the same spot he had been during the warden's last visit to Red Cliff. This time, Khazar wasn't looking northeast, toward the circle tower, but rather northwest, to the far-off shapes of the Frostback Mountains. Khazar gestured as Jowan neared, and the guard behind him yelped. A glance back showed that the man was trapped behind a wall of fire. When Jowan faced his friend, he was startled by the amused smirk the elf cast the guard. "That's far enough for you, I think." He turned his attention to his fellow mage. "Hello, Jowan." Jowan froze, because Khazar was smiling at him. It was a cocky, amused smile, just like the ones he'd used to wear back at the circle tower. He hadn't seen this smile since Khazar had taken the grey. "Stop staring, Jowan. It makes you look like a simpleton." A laugh burst out of him, and he closed the distance between them to stand beside him against the balustrade. "You're in a good mood." "I suppose I am." Khazar turned his gaze back out over the lake. "Even though the others know about, you know." Khazar snorted. "My blood magic?" "Yeah, they know about it. It's saved their asses a half-dozen times by now." "Wait, you've been using it?" That wasn't good. He thought. He'd only used his own in emergencies, and even being careful he could barely fight back the demons that pestered him in the Fade each night. "Of course." Khazar rolled his eyes. "What's the point of having it if you don't use it?" Something in his friend's tone rang alarm bells in Jowan's head. Khazar said that like it was obvious fact. It shouldn't be, not with blood magic. Khazar was watching him out of the corner of his eye. "I wouldn't expect you to be able to understand." "Hey. What's that supposed to mean?" Khazar laughed, head thrown back freely, and Jowan goggled. "I'd forgotten what a nervous little mouse you were." He smiled shakily. "Well, you've always been bold enough for the both of us." "Very true." Khazar paused thoughtfully. "Still, you have your uses." It alarmed Jowan that he couldn't tell whether the elf was joking. "Without your bumbling, I never would have become a warden, and would still be under the thumb of those damned Templars. Glad I could be of service, I guess." Khazar chuckled. "Oh, you certainly should be." There was something going on here. Khazar's tone was off. The elf had always been cocky, but not like this. "I wouldn't be what I am today without your cowardice, and for that, you should be commended." "Cowardice? Commended? For that matter, simpleton?" Khazar didn't talk like this. Jowan was too uneasy to respond. Khazar didn't seem to care. He turned back to looking out over the lake. "I think I might be strong enough, now. If we meet the archdemon, I'll be able to take it out. With the help of your fellows, of course." "Ha! Those fools couldn't handle a woman shapeshifted as a dragon. They'll have no chance against one with the soul of an old god." He turned his eyes back to Jowan, and they burned with excited fervor. "We saw the archdemon in the deep roads. We know where it is. All I'd need to do is go down there again as I am now and I could take it out. I could single-handedly end the blight in one blow. Those mortals are just holding me back. Jowan felt his world rock. It was a slip, one that Khazar obviously didn't realize he'd said. The small elf turned back to gazing out over the lake, toward the location of the archdemon, Jowan realized, and it was all Jowan could do to stay upright and breathe as panic crawled up his spine. Mortals. As in, Khazar wasn't. As in, Khazar had become what all mages knew never to become. And with all the pride he was showing, Jowan had no illusions about what manner of creature Khazar was. Oh Maker, Khazar was an abomination, and it was all Jowan's fault. It was all he could do to nod and hold back tears as his friend continued to monologue, oblivious to Jowan's turmoil. Thank the Maker that pride was by definition self-centered, because it would have detected Jowan's realization otherwise. Asking Khazar about his deal with Connor's demon was the least of their worries now, because who could guess what sort of dangerous concoction a talented, volatile mage and a major pride demon would create? And worse than that was the clawing, tearing guilt. He had done this. He had told the demon about Khazar. He had begged Khazar to help destroy his phylactery, and then fled, leaving his friend to have no choice but to take the grey. He had bumbled Connor's education, leading to Khazar going into the Fate and meeting Connor's demon, all alone. Khazar, his best friend, was gone. And it was all Jowan's fault. 103 Reunions and Revelations, the second. Alistair wasn't sure which one of them did it. Brother Genitivi had flatly refused to do it himself, declaring that he wasn't worthy of it, since he hadn't gone through the gauntlet. And it wasn't Alistair himself because, well, he'd have preferred to save all the ashes he could for Eamon. But it might have been any of the rest of them. Mila had been growing frustrated with their slow pace, while Leliana had expressed how much it looked like the leg hurt. One of the elves might have done it for chuckles. Finian's voice hadn't healed miraculously overnight by sheer coincidence after all. By Androsta, even Wynne was a healer at heart, and would have likely dipped into the pouch to ease the old man's pain. Whoever it was, Alistair kept his mouth shut about it, because they moved a lot faster once the ashes had healed Genitivi's leg. And he wasn't going to complain about anything that got them back to Red Cliff faster. He was strung tight as a bowstring by the time the castle came in sight, a silhouette on the next hill, and he felt like he could finally breathe again. They were almost there, and they had, most of, what they'd gone to retrieve. Soon, Eamon would be awake, and he'd finally fix things. Do you think the others have returned yet? Leliana's voice asked as they approached. Alistair was in the lead, so he had to peek over his shoulder to see them. They were heading into the deep roads, dear, Wynne said. Such a journey is bound to take quite a while. Right, Alistair said. Because us trekking the long way across Ferelden twice was a hop and a skip, wasn't it? The deep roads are quite vast, Genitivi said. Really, the length of such a journey would depend on their destination. Have you been into the deep roads, brother? That was Finn, ever curious. The old man chuckled. Not inside them, no, the dwarves would never have let me in. I did, however, spend a bit of time in Orzammar, who keep highly detailed records of such things. I cannot imagine staying in such a place for any extended period of time, Mila volunteered. It sounds dark and soulless. I assure you, it is neither, Genitivi said with another laugh. The magma ensures that there is plenty of heat and light, and the soul of the people is carved into the very stone above their heads. Their pride is not unlike that of your own people. Mila made a doubtful sound, but nonetheless fell into a pensive silence. Leliana's hand threaded into hers while she thought, and Alistair hid a smile by turning forward again. Who knew that all Mila needed to mellow out was a pretty face to moon at? As they crested the final rise before the Red Cliff gates, barking filled the air. A moment later, a familiar Maberry tore through the open gates and bounded toward them, still barking his head off. Genitivi paused, and Fang growled, but the rest of them just smiled. Well, that answers that question, Alistair said as Hugo vaulted into their group and tackled Finian to the ground. Everyone laughed as the dog gave him a couple sloppy kisses, then hopped off the elf to bounce around them, barking playfully. My, but this creature certainly does have a long memory, Wynne said with some amusement. You don't know the half of it, Finian said with a grin, hopping smoothly back to his feet. The reason he likes me is because I played fetch with him once. On our way to Ostagar. Alistair gave a low whistle. It is fortunate, then, that you did not mistreat him, no. Zevran said. Or else we would have a dog plotting vengeance upon you, and that would simply be too amusing to stop. So, you wouldn't save me from a Maberry attack, because you would find it funny. Hilarious. I would be sad, Amor, but I would also be laughing. You are the worst bodyguard ever. Mila, can I trade Zevran for Fang? Absolutely not, Lethalin. And I must warn you that if you intend to make an illicit switch during the night, wild wolves do not take as kindly to being hidden up your sleeve as you might think. And thus they were laughing as they walked through the red cliff gate and into the courtyard. On the top of the stairs in front of them stood Percival and Tegan. Tegan was wearing a relieved smile and Percy, well, he was looking relaxed, and that might as well have been a smile, on him. The pair started descending the stairs to meet them. Alistair. Ban Tegan called. Welcome back. How was your mission? A roaring success, minus the dragons and evil cults and whatnot, Alistair replied with a smirk. I've got a pinch of ashes right here. He patted the pouch on his belt. And judging by how they healed Finn's voice, Leliana added brightly, they most certainly work. Finian turned wide, innocent brown eyes to the bard. Why, Leliana? How could you accuse me of using the ashes for personal gain? I never touched that pouch. Zevran chuckled. You found the urn. An excitable voice called, and Alistair's stomach did this funny flipping thing. Felicity scurried up to them, having come from the lower entrance. Her eyes darted between all of them. I can scarcely believe it. It must have been amazing. You took notes, right, Win? Yes, of course, dear. And you're all well. You can't imagine what a relief it is to see all of you hail. Well, Alistair said, we did have miraculous healing ashes, so, any major injuries sorted themselves out. So that part of the legend is also true? That's amazing. Felicity turned that stunning smile to Alistair, and he found his mouth too dry to speak properly. Oh Maker, last time he'd seen her, he'd kissed her. It had seemed like the thing to do at the time, but now what? Was he expected to kiss her again? Not that he didn't want to, but one didn't just grab a lady and plant one her, he didn't think. Unless, you didn't get bumped on the head, did you, Alistair? Felicity moved closer, her grin all playful and relieved, and then her hand was on the back of his head. Because if you did, I don't think the healing did a very good job. He swallowed past the dryness of his throat. And if I didn't get bumped on the head? She thought for a moment, her smile brightening. Then, considering the variables of the circumstances and your personality, I suppose the only logical reaction is to be flattered. His laugh was brief, but heartfelt, dissolving his nervousness in fond warmth. This was Felicity, there was no need to act like a shy chantry boy around her. He reached up and ran a hand through her hair, then cradled the back of her head to pull her close, so that their foreheads were touching. Her deep brown eyes sparkled, and he could get completely lost in those eyes, literally, given the labyrinthine mind behind them. I missed you, he said thickly. Her hand was still in his hair, moving gently through it. And yet you don't even bring me a gift, she teased softly. I believe social protocol dictates you give a woman a gift after calling her fat and then not seeing her for a month. That reminded him of something, and he jerked back. Oh, I did. Get you a gift, I mean. Well, a person actually. He pulled away from her, pausing to note her puzzled/amused expression. Not that a person can be a gift, and he did come of his own accord on his way to Denerim, but never mind that. You'll love this. Alistair took her hand and walked her over to where the rest of the group was still in discussion with Tegan and Percy. Felicity, this is Brother Genitivi. Brother, this is the girl I told you about. Felicity's eyes went so wide that Alistair was worried they might fall out of her head. Meanwhile, the Chantry scholar smiled and said, pleased to meet you. Felicity worked her lips a couple times, seeming completely at a loss for words for perhaps the first time in her life. Finian nudged her gently. He's way better than Notes. Felicity's breath whooshed out of her. Brother Genitivi. Wow, this is an honor. I've read all your works, including the ones that weren't technically allowed in the Circle Tower. You're brilliant, and I've got so many questions about your travels. When observing the Cunary, did you ever note any family units, or did you never get close enough? If a lyrium potion allows full access to the Fade for a short time, why are the effects cumulative? Has any dwarf or other geologist of merit ever investigated Dragon's Peak, as having a potentially active volcano above the largest city in Ferelden seems ill-advised? And I'm babbling, aren't I? Genitivi chuckled. I am always happy to meet an eager student. He turned to Alistair. You were right, she is quite bright. She's also been into the deep roads, Finian piped up. That piqued the scholar's interest. He turned back to Felicity. Is that so? Felicity colored prettily. Well, yes, I have. We went as far as Bonamar. I mapped it, if you're interested. I most certainly am, Genitivi said with a bright smile. Lead the way, Miss Amel. Felicity was bursting with pride and excitement as she started leading the scholar back into the castle. Immediately, the air filled with her resumed stream of questions, about the history of the deep trenches, and Flemeth, and anything that came to mind apparently, while the Chantry scholar listened raptly and answered when given the chance. Alistair watched her go, smiling. To his grinning companions, he said, I think she liked her present. This actually tore the girl away from Genitivi for a moment. She excused herself and ran back to Alistair, and he barely got his arms up in time to catch her as she launched herself into him. Her lips were on his before he knew what was happening, but he wasn't about to complain. Maker, he'd missed her voice, and her smell, and her warmth, and everything about her. As fast as the kiss had come, it was gone, leaving him a little dazed. I love it, she gushed. You're amazing. Then, she turned and ran back to Genitivi's side, thrumming with excitement as she led him inside. We escorted him too, yes. Zevran said. Why do we not get a kiss? Alistair couldn't seem to wipe the goofy grin from his face. She thinks I'm amazing. Don't let it go to your head, Tin Can, rumbled a voice that Alistair hadn't heard in a long time. She's had a rough couple of weeks. Too many lyrium potions. Garrot walked smoothly down the stairs, a red-headed dwarf in tow. The redhead laughed. Nothing wrong with a crazy lady, now and then. Makes things exciting, if you know what I mean. The dwarf gave them a lascivious wink. Zevran laughed. Why, I could not agree more. He threw an arm around Finn. My warden here recently had an encounter with a dragon himself, except that he actually jumped on its back and rode it. It gave me more than a couple ideas for riding in other ways, as it were. Percy went completely white, staring at the two elves blankly. Alistair wondered whether the other man was about to faint. Meanwhile, Garrot roared a laugh. You rode a dragon? Elf, what is it with you and jumping on things that wanna eat you? Finn shrugged, looking bashful, for once. Guess I like things exciting. Zevran nodded solemnly. That you do, Amor. Rest assured, it is not a fault. Alistair snorted. You would say that. Heh. Garrot turned a discerning eye on the Antivan. You must be the assassin I keep hearing about. Carta Thug here. Pleased to meet ya and all that. Garrot held out a hand. Well met, Carta Thug. The assassin shook it with a grin, and Alistair had the feeling that this may be the start of a very disturbing alliance. Maybe not dangerous, he was past the point where he blindly mistrusted either of them, but certainly disturbing. Bah, more elves, the redhead said, taking a swig of something that, judging by the smell, was definitely not water. None o' you are as touchy as the one we got, right? Define touchy, Alistair said, throwing a pointed glance at Mila. The Dalish elf ignored him. And you are? Name's Okaran. Wardens picked me up in Orzammer, and I stuck like a bad rash. Do you have a problem with elves? She asked, though it was less of a challenge and more curiosity. Nah, Okaran said. As long as you all don't bother me with your frolicking or whatever, we're good. Frolicking? Finn asked, holding back a laugh. Mila tilted her head thoughtfully. I am not sure whether this is insulting or not. Lelyana giggled. If it helps, I have never seen any of you frolic. Why, I am quite good at it, dear Bard, Zevran said. Although, that greatly depends upon how you define frolic. Alistair groaned in Percy and Tegan's general direction. Do you see what I've had to put up with? How have I not lost my mind? Percival was still eyeing Finn and Zevran. In a whisper he asked, are those two, together? Oh boy. Why yes, we are. Zevran said loudly. Also, my friend. Elves have very good hearing. It's not a big deal, Percy, Alistair said. Mila and Lelyana have shared a couple kisses too. He waved behind him at the women in question, suddenly feeling a very stony glare on the back of his neck. Percy stared at Alistair blankly. Oh ho. Yeah, don't say. Okaren crowed, eyeing the women in question. You, and you, eh? Play in horizontal handball? Ever need a referee? Heh. That is disgusting, Lelyana informed him sagely. Alistair scratched at the back of his neck. He just knew Mila was glaring at him, but it wasn't like it was a secret, right? They'd kissed right in front of them. He would never understand the ball of crazy known as Mila Mahariel. So how did your mission go? Finian asked Garrot. Sneaky little guy, changing the subject. Alistair also noticed that he'd taken a step away from Zevran, apparently to keep from breaking Percival's brain. Well enough, the dwarf said with a shrug. We had to wade into darkspawn-infested ruins and kill metal suit monsters, then got to play Kingmaker in the worst way, so Orzammer as usual. Also, we killed a dragon, Okaren said. That part's not as important, but it sure does make us sound good. Alistair, there is one thing. At least Percival seemed to have snapped out of it, since he was talking like a normal person again. We went back to Ostagar, and found a couple of Duncan's personal possessions. We thought it only right that you have them. Alistair's throat tightened, but he bit back the old wave of grief and nodded. Thank you. Percival nodded back. All right, let's get this done. He turned to head back up the steps, and the rest followed with surprising ease. If you've got the ashes, we'd best wake Eamon immediately. Loghain's men are getting either brave or restless, neither of which are good for our side. We could use a political mind like Eamon's. When had Percy gotten so commanding, exactly? And, wait. Alistair stopped. Shouldn't we wait for Marnan? Everyone stopped, and Alistair's stomach dropped as he saw Percy's shoulders stiffen. He and Garrot exchanged a silent look, and the dwarf nodded grimly. Percy sighed and turned back around, standing above them all on the steps. Marnan won't be coming. She died in the deep roads. Behind them, Lelyana gasped. It was a death she would have wanted, in battle, with honor. Garrot snorted. And surrounded by a ring of dead darkspawn. The words were delivered so matter-of-factly that it took a minute for Alistair to process them. Marnan, dead? But, she had been the most competent of all of them. She'd actually known what she was doing. Oh Maker, how could they hope to fight the final battle without her? I'm going to miss her, Finian said softly. Yeah, I know the feeling, Garrot rumbled gravely. She and me had our differences, but she was good people. World needs more like her. It wasn't the sort of thing that he'd ever have expected out of Garrot, but they'd all had a lot of time to change in the intervening time. When they'd split, Percy had still been pretty wrecked, and Felicity had been torn up about not meeting Brother Genitivi, and Zevran had still been a borderline threat, and Mila had been in her shell, and Alistair had been a naive boy who just wanted the perfect family he'd always secretly dreamed of. They'd all had time to change. Alistair hung his head. Wow, that one was, wow. It's dangerous stuff, being a warden during a blight, isn't it? We'll get through it, Alistair, Percy assured him. We just have to keep moving forward. Now come on, let's wake Eamon. 104 An abrupt departure. The hall outside Eamon's room was cluttered, as if they were all waiting for either a birth or a death. The two healers and Tegan had gone inside with the pouch of ashes some time ago, and the wait was making some of the wardens go a little stir-crazy. The ex-Templar had pulled a chair up from somewhere and set it right next to the door. He slumped in it now, his feet tapping and fingers fidgeting. Next to him stood a pale-faced kid named Connor, waiting for news about whether he'd lose his daddy too. Garrot kinda hurt for the kid. It had to be hard, seeing his entire family knocked down in one blow. Not that the Sprout knew what that blow was, the kid had no memory of what had happened, as far as anyone could tell. Garrot knew the story better than the kid did, and he'd literally been under a rock during the entire mess. Garrot leaned against the wall opposite Alistair. Everyone else was arranged along the walls down the corridor: elf, drunkard, assassin, Dalish elf, bard, witch, Cunary, the kid, even the blood mage had been dragged out of somewhere. Now, he was trussed up in anticipation of Eamon's judgment, a guardsman close at hand behind him. The captain paced between them, his pooch watching him at it with an occasional anxious whine. Of all of them, Percival seemed to be the most nervous about the outcome, which was kinda funny, considering Alistair was the one with the personal connection. Ah well, maybe it was just part of Captain Kisland's special brand of crazy. Finally, Felicity's head poked out of the doorway. She flashed them a tired smile. "Connor and Alistair, you can come in now," said Blond. Jumped to his feet, but recovered himself before he physically shoved past the girl he was sweet on. He and Connor filed into the room, and Felicity disappeared again with a soft shut of the door. Percival sat in his vacated seat, slumping forward in relief. "Maker. I suppose that means he's all right, at least." "I wonder what took so long," Finn asked softly. "When the ashes healed my throat, it was instantaneous." But a poison destroys much more than a single part of the body, my warden," the assassin said beside him. "There was far more to heal. The ashes are miraculous, but not that miraculous." Garrot snorted a laugh. "Why did you guys take so little of it?" Khazar asked, disdain thick. The kid had been a real piece of work, lately. Killing Flemeth had gone to his head, as far as Garrot could tell. Watching the tug and pull between him and the captain was hilarious. "If we had the whole urn, we'd be invincible. We could crush both the Blight and Loghain without a scratch." "Miracles aren't meant to work that way," the bard said. "Anyone who was so greedy as to take the entire urn for themselves would be selfish and thoughtless not to leave some for future generations." "So," the kid said succinctly. "The Immortal Guardian wouldn't have allowed it anyway," Finian said. "It's a moot point. It was either take just a pinch, or get squashed by a 1,000-year-old ghost." "This from the guy who rode a dragon," Garrot chuckled. Finn smiled back. "What can I say? I couldn't climb the Guardian, no good footholds. I'm afraid of things I can't climb." Their conversation was interrupted by the door again, this time opening wide to allow a group of people to step out into the hall. First was the old woman in Amel, then a man Garrot had seen only in sleeping form. Eamon's eyes were sharp, for a guy his age. His gaze swept over all of them, and Garrot recognized the same political type of mind behind a gentle facade that he'd seen 100 times in Orzammar. Most recently, he'd seen it in Belen and Harrowmont, before the former cut the head off the latter, anyway. Garrot exchanged a glance with Finian, who nodded to indicate that he saw it too. He doubted anyone else was sharp enough to see it. They'd have to be careful if they were handing their reins over to this guy. Having a good politician on their side wasn't a bad thing, but they needed to make sure they didn't get the short end of that deal. Tegan and Alistair followed Eamon out. "Everyone," Alistair said, beaming. "This is Arl Eamon. Eamon, meet the last resistance Ferelden has against the Blight." Eamon smiled with soft humor. "Certainly an eclectic group. It is nice to meet you all. Your companions have informed me of the situation, and I feel it is imperative that we act immediately." Percival stood. "And what action would that be?" Eamon's eyes turned to the golden boy, and the old man paused. "You look familiar, Warden." "Percival Cousland, sir. Last living member of my line." "Is that so? I'm sorry to hear that, son. Your father was a good man." Eamon looked genuinely saddened by that news. "Must have been hard, actually, to fall asleep for a couple months and wake up in a completely different world." "So?" the witch asked impatiently. "What is to be our course of action?" "A land's meet. Eamon shook off his grief for now, his voice gaining its previous confidence. I will call a land's meet immediately, summoning all Ferelden's leaders to Denerim to take control back from the usurper. Once that's done, we will have the armies of the other Arlings to call from, which means we will be able to march against the archdemon. We already have an army, Khazar snapped. One with mages, and Dalish, and golems. What more could a bunch of humans do? We should be marching now. I think, child, you misunderstand the sheer numbers of the horde. The fuck I do. We just got back from the deep roads. You've been asleep for the entire blight. If anything, you misunderstand what a couple well-prepared wardens can do. Yep. Killing Flemeth had definitely gone right to his head. Even his old circle buddy seemed afraid of him now. Khazar, Percy sighed, we are not marching on the horde with Loghain nipping at our heels. Forget Loghain. He's nothing but a flash in the pan. The blight is real, and long, and permanent if it isn't stopped. Let this old man handle the politics. We need to head for that archdemon now. Khazar. Percival drew himself up to full height, his voice snapping out with all the authority of a tried and tested general. We are going to Denerim for the land's meet, and that is final. Something happened, then. Garrot wasn't quite sure what it was, but it seemed to shake up the other wardens. Khazar's whole mien changed into something far more dangerous than a little elf kid. His eyes flickered with red light for the briefest of moments, and when he next spoke, there was an undercurrent of a much deeper voice speaking alongside his own. I will not be commanded. You have been holding me back, and I refuse to tolerate it any longer. Go to your land's meet, humans. By the time you are finished, I will have taken care of the blight myself. To punctuate his point, he launched a fireball into the middle of the hallway, but Wynne and Felicity both snapped up elemental shields to contain most of the damage. Garrot felt a blast of heat on his face all the same. Once the smoke had cleared, Khazar was gone. Eamon called for his guards to chase down the kid, but Garrot knew the only thing they'd have to show for it was a few new burns, if they were lucky. Alistair turned wide eyes to Percival. Percy, that was. I know. The captain had gone pale, staring at the spot the kid had disappeared from. Garrot raised his hand. I don't. What just happened? Khazar's an abomination, Garrot, Felicity said softly. Like the kid had torn out her heart with that one. How did that happen? Alistair said, and he sounded accusing now. When we separated, he was a piece of work, sure, but he didn't have a demon inside him. It had to be the blood magic, Felicity said. After all, blood magic does make one more susceptible to demonic influence. Wait, hold up. Blood magic? Khazar's been using blood magic. Alistair turned an incredulous look on Percy. And you knew about this? Then, to Felicity. And you knew about this? Everyone knew about this. Garrot didn't care for the accusation in the Templar's voice, even if it was mostly directed away from him. He stepped in, crossing his arms. Hard to miss, when it saved our asses a bunch o' times. Felicity, Wynne asked sharply, is this true? The other mage was near tears. She nodded. We tried to get him to stop, but he refused. He's been getting more standoffish, we should have noticed something was wrong. I don't think so, Garrot said. However it happened, this was gradual. None of us couldn't known. The Dalish elf spoke up. Of more import than arguing about how it happened, is deciding what to do about it. Are we going after him? Can he yet be saved? Saved. Alistair said, his incredulity rising to dangerous levels. He'd probably pop a vein soon. He's been dealing with demons, and you want to save him. He is as kin to me, she said sharply. Of course I want to save him. That's all well and dandy, but it's not even possible. There's no way to separate an abomination. Yes, Felicity said quietly, her voice warbling a bit, but she managed not to start bawling, thank the stone. There is. The spell used for. Her eyes flickered toward the Arl's room, where Connor still lingered. The one Khazar used here. It may be possible. That pulled the momentum right out of Alistair, and he stared at the girl in shock. You too, Felicity? We need every warden we can get, don't you think? Especially with Marnan gone. Without Khazar's firepower, our chances of defeating the archdemon will drop significantly. Put that much stock into his fireballs, do you? And now he was snapping at his girlfriend. Stone, this whole thing had the Templar tightly wound. Yes, but it's more than that. We're Grey Wardens, and that means we must stand together. We owe him to try to save him, even from himself. She wiped at her eyes. He won't thank us for it, but it's enough that he be safe and free. Alistair stared at the girl for a while. Then, he heaved a sigh, rubbing a hand over his eyes. Andraste's knickers. Fine. Let's go after the bloody elf and drag him back kicking and screaming. Sounds like fun. Alistair, Eamon broke in. We're going to need you at the land's meet. Without you, we have no means of challenging Loghain. Alistair stiffened, then turned wide eyes to Eamon. That's your plan? Using my bloodline to? Eamon, you know I want no part in that. We won't have a choice, Alistair. Well, this was interesting. There was something being unsaid here. No. I refuse. And you know what? I have a good reason to go after that abomination, better than anyone here. Alistair drew himself up straight. I was trained as a Templar. If anyone can handle Khazar at his most possessed, it'll be me. Alistair, we need you here. Garrot watched with grim amusement as Eamon saw his plan crumbling around him. You don't even know where the boy went or what he intends. I do. That soft, squeaky voice was Jowan's, who everyone had forgotten was even there, tucked into the far corner as he was. His guard tugged at his bindings, but the mage still met their gazes grimly. He's going back to the dead trenches, where you lot saw the archdemon. He's going to try to take it down himself. Is he strong enough to walk into the deep roads alone? Finn asked. With a demon inside him, possibly, Felicity said. She cast a quick look at Alistair. I wish to come too. To make sure he gets back all right. And I. Mila stepped forward. I will help track him. Even into the deep roads. The bard asked. He is kin to me, Satisolan. I will follow him to the realm of the Forgotten Ones themselves. Leliana took the elf's hand. Then I will come with you. I want to go, too. That was Jowan again. Everyone turned to stare at the apostate, who swallowed. You are in no position to go anywhere, Tegan said harshly. Please, Arleman. Jowan tried to step toward the noble, but his guard tugged him back. I know I have a lot to answer for, and I swear that I will, but Khazar was, my best friend, and the ritual is going to need me. Blood magic will not be necessary, Felicity was quick to say. We can get lyrium when we go through Orzammer. You're still going to need at least 2 mages. And it's my spell, I know it better than either you or Win. Said Enchanter was pursing her lips in quiet disapproval, but had yet to comment. Why save him at all? Tegan asked. He wasn't mean about it, he seemed more baffled than anything. Even if you manage it, it will be a waste of time and resources when we will need all the forces we can muster at the land's meet. A land's meet will take a while to gather, won't it? Finn said thoughtfully. For all the nobles to gather their men and head to Denerim? I'm sure this will be taken care of by the time everyone's ready. But I do not see why you insist on chasing a boy who has all but abandoned you. Did you not do the same, Tegan, risking everything for your brother? Finian gestured at Eamon, who was wearing the look of a man who'd accidentally swallowed nug droppings with his porridge. You led a ragtag defense of the town and gave yourself over to a demon, all in hopes of saving your fallen, demon-bound brother. Isn't it the least we can do, to do the same for our brother? And you expect us, Eamon said slowly, to allow Alistair to go on this dangerous mission, when he will be needed in Denerim. He's the only person in Ferelden who is both Templar and Warden. This makes him uniquely suited to facing an abomination in the deep roads. Finn shrugged. Or else you could force him to come with you, and risk losing several more wardens in the deep roads instead. That will leave us with, 4 of us to face the horde. The words were getting through to Eamon. This was a man who wasn't used to being told no, no doubt relying on his easy manner to grease most wheels. But Alistair was kicking back, so he knew that the only way to keep things moving was to make sure that his tool's side mission was as efficient as possible. Smart elf. Garrot was glad he was on their side. Very well, Eamon said around a sigh. Alistair, this task must be carried out as quickly as possible. It will take only a matter of weeks before the land's meat will be ready. 2 weeks. Promise me that you will be in Denerim in 2 weeks, whether you find this boy or not. I promise, Alistair said gravely. Jowan, Eamon said, turning to the apostate, I will allow you to go as well. But you will come right back here afterward. Alistair, I am charging you with the responsibility of seeing him back to Redcliffe to face justice for his crimes. Of course, Eamon. You have my word. In the meantime, Percival broke in, the rest of us should head for Denerim. At the very least, we can feel out the situation with the rest of the nobility. Figure out who's on our side, Finian said with a nod. Start greasing the palms of the ones that ain't, Garrot said with a wink at the elf. An excellent idea, Eamon sighed. At the very least, the word of a cow's land should help offset whatever lies Loghain has been spreading. You may stay in my city estate, as a sign of my personal support. We thank you, Arl, Percival said diplomatically. You 5 had better get going as soon as possible, if you want to catch up with Khazar before he gets into the tunnels. Right, Alistair sighed. It was nice seeing you all again, as short as that lasted. Some of us are rather enjoying the shortness of it, Morrigan said with a smirk. Right, yes. Didn't miss you. Mila was the one to sigh and start off down the hall, nodding a short farewell as she passed. Leliana followed, pausing to give Finian a hug. Only when Felicity had exchanged a couple soft words with Wynne did she and Alistair head off as well, the latter grabbing Jowan by the ear and dragging him off as well. That left the rest of them, all set to head for the Ferelden capital, apparently. Well, Percival sighed. We'd better get packing ourselves. We'll be leaving for Denerim first thing in the morning. 105 Chasing the Prodigal Warden. So then I say something like, we have to find a way to bring it down, which apparently Finn took as suggestion, because next thing I know, he runs out of nowhere and jumps up on its back. I think the dragon was as surprised as we were. Felicity laughed weakly, letting Alistair's voice soothe the anxiety that churned inside her. Churning because of the boy who, despite his protests, she wanted to protect like a little brother. Some big sister she had turned out to be, how could she have been so foolish? Wasn't she supposed to be the intelligent one? Shouldn't she have been able to identify the signs? Leliana spoke up behind them. I thought the part where Zevran got all fierce and protective was really sweet. Do not be a busybody, Sadisolin. Ah, but it was cute. It was also not our affair. Mila's chiding was matter of fact, almost gentle. It lent credence to the discovery that she and the singer were involved. Mila must have changed quite a bit for the better, to countenance such a connection with a human. The 5th member of their group, Jowan, remained in the back, silently following them with his eyes trained on his toes. Felicity wasn't really sure what to make of him. She dearly wanted to mistrust him. He was a blood mage, after all, and his bumbling was part of what had set all this off, but she found that she couldn't. Jowan had always been entirely non-threatening, there wasn't a malevolent cell in the man's body. There wasn't an intelligent one, either, and that was something of the problem, but the man had never meant any harm, and that was what was important, right? So the dragon flies up and away, and for a minute I swear we'll never see either of them again. But then, bang! The dragon runs into one of the valley walls. Felicity listened distractedly, her mind elsewhere. She tried to calculate the odds of taking down Khazar without hurting him. If Alistair could just get a good smite on him, they'd be okay, at least until the ritual was done. Jowan's ritual. She shuddered to think that they would be using blood magic, but it was the lesser of two evils. And at least the deep roads would probably have enough lyrium to accommodate the spell without requiring a sacrifice. Belen owed them, he would have little choice but to provide them with the necessary lyrium when they passed through Orzammar. It really did work out quite nicely, all things considered. Am I that boring? Alistair's voice broke in. Felicity smiled up at him apologetically. His face was twisted into a boyish pout. I'm sorry, it's not that, I'm just a bit distracted by the circumstances. Alistair sighed. I suppose that makes sense. They walked in silence for a moment. Alistair, however, was not one for silence. So, blood magic? How long, do you think? I'm pretty sure he wasn't practicing when we left the Circle Tower. If he had been, he wouldn't have been so angry with Jowan about it. She paused, remembering the events that had led them both to being recruited. It felt like a long time ago, when it had only been a couple months. Although, come to think of it, he did not express any actual upset about the practice itself, he was more angered by the fact that Jowan had concealed it from him. I wouldn't be surprised if Jowan's taking up blood magic prompted him to do so as well. It's not like I encouraged him or anything. Jowan's voice said thinly from the back of the group. The point still stands that you learned blood magic, then he did. Those two things cannot be coincidences. Jowan sputtered ineffectually. You were his friend, yes? Leliana asked. Did you never talk about it? And never. It is likely that Delethalin looked to his elder companion to set an example, and thus took his learning blood magic as permission of a sort. Felicity cast a curious look back at the Dalish elf, who shrugged. He is younger of mind than he would have any of us think. Jowan had gone ghost white. I didn't mean. I never wanted him to take it up. You think he looked up to me? That's hard to believe. Alistair snorted. I'll say. Felicity, however, wasn't so sure. Jowan and Khazar had always been inseparable, and they had always been just the two of them. Felicity knew well what extremes loneliness could drive one to. It made one cling to what little one had, even if that one thing happened to be Jowan. Then again, Mila continued, Delethalin is very utilitarian. It may simply be that he sees such things as a tool. Thus, when given the chance to learn blood magic, he took it, as a matter of practicality. Felicity hated to admit it, but Mila had a point. That was exactly how Khazar thought. Perhaps not all the blame could be on Jowan, then. Which made her feel all the guiltier for not somehow noticing and stopping it. Alistair snorted a laugh. So at what point did letting a demon make him a puppet come into it? It's not like that, Felicity said. My understanding is that when a mage becomes an abomination, the two halves merge into one. You remember Uldred, claiming to be a newly reborn creature. Alistair shuddered. How could I forget? Khazar's mind would currently carry his memories and desires as well as those of the demon. Neither side is in control, necessarily, although one may be more dominant in the merging than the other. But Alistair seemed to be turning something over in his head. He cast a worried glance at Felicity. The thing is, when Connor was possessed, there were definitely two of them in there. That made Felicity's stomach drop. If the circumstance with Connor had been different than the current one, would the Fade ritual still work? How do you mean? Well, most of the time, Connor acted like that, acting on Connor's memories and desires, but definitely heavy on the desire demon side. But then, a couple times, this scared little boy broke through, and he'd start crying and asking what was going on. Leliana made a sympathetic noise. That sounds horrible. So you're saying, Felicity said slowly, that Connor's original self would still manifest? That they weren't completely merged? Sure didn't seem like it. That was bad. What if their ability to free Connor had merely been an effect of that? What if Jowan's ritual didn't work on a completely merged abomination? There was one person here who might be able to answer that question better than she, but it was a long shot. She stopped and turned, and their party stopped with her. Jowan. What are you asking me for? I don't know anything about abominations. Not that. Maker, he was difficult to bear at times. Jowan, what are the chances of the ritual working, really? On a fully joined abomination like Khazar, not a bumbling one like Connor. Jowan swallowed audibly. Well, it may be a bit more difficult, yes. Especially since both the mage and the demon are likely to fight back, and they're both really strong. Alistair's eyes narrowed at him. Now wait. How would you know how strong the demon is? Jowan went even paler. His voice shook as he spoke next. Well, it makes sense, doesn't it? Khazar's strong, so the demon must be strong to take him. Leliana shook her head. You are a very bad liar. How you ever managed to hide the fact you were a blood mage, Alistair agreed, I'll never know. Jowan, Felicity said, trying not to let frustration get the best of her. We need to know the truth, so we have the best possible chance of success. What, exactly, are we facing? His head drooped in defeat, his long fingers clasped tightly together. I'm sorry. I didn't mean. He took a breath to steady himself. It's a pride demon. A powerful on. I met him once, in the Fade. He's the one that taught me, and then he found out about Khazar and it's all my fault because I was too much of a coward to face him and now my best friend is a monster when I never dash. Jowan. Felicity's healing instincts kicked in. Breathe. She couldn't stay angry with him, not when he was obviously already fighting himself about it. A pride demon, Alistair muttered, brows furrowed. That's a doozy. Are we up for that? It can't be much worse than Uldred, yes. Leliana said. With Uldred we had 2 healers, Felicity said. Also, Uldred was distracted by his ritual. If that was him distracted, Alistair said lightly, I'd have hated to see him going all out. He rubbed at his chest plate, and Felicity winced at the memory of seeing the man's armor caved in. It was not an experience she wanted to have again. That was another reason the thought of engaging Khazar filled her with apprehension. If Khazar didn't get beaten into submission, then Alistair would. If Khazar transformed, the warrior would be their main line of defense. She could easily remember the sheer physical force that Uldred's demon had wielded. Was Khazar's demon as powerful as that? Was he more? They started up the road again in thoughtful silence. Maybe we can look through your notes from the circle, Leliana said. This made Felicity shift her bag nervously. Her far lighter bag. I do not have them, at the moment. I left my codex with Brother Genitivi. That made Alistair stop dead. He turned to stare at her, and seemed incapable of talking for a moment. Wait, you mean you left your book, which you've been dragging around since Ostagar, in Redcliffe? Felicity shifted uncomfortably. She could feel their regard, and understood why they were surprised. It must have seemed out of character. She tried to explain, speed is of the essence. It seemed silly to be bogged down by such a heavy tome, when very little of the information kept within would come in handy in this particular situation. Her explanation did not alleviate the staring and she felt her face flush. Mila's brows lowered. Did you not have maps of the deep roads that may be useful for navigation? I did look to bring those, yes. However, when I searched my codex, I found that they had already been ripped out. Genitivi? Alistair asked. No. I asked, but he had no idea. I think it might have been Khazar. Alistair looked stunned. You're saying? Khazar is planning his route. He's seeking the dead trenches, Felicity said. Where we saw the archdemon. He may be rash, but he's not foolish enough to wander the deep roads without a map. So if he's got our maps, how do we keep from getting lost? Jowan asked nervously. We follow him, Mila said, and do not lose the trail. Felicity nodded. I can help a bit with navigation from memory, provided we follow the same paths we did previously. However, if he deviates, I will not be of much help. Then let's hope he doesn't deviate. Alistair's jaw was set in a grim line, and he turned and wordlessly led them along the path again. 106 Whose tent is this, anyway? For the first time in his life, Percival felt like he was an honest-to-maker soldier. There was just something about having men in Redcliffe tabards setting up camp around him, the tents organized into neat rows, with the larger circular pavilion of the command tent in the center that made it all feel official. The camp wasn't large, but it was organized. He had a vague impression that Ostagar had felt like this, but he couldn't remember enough of his night there to say for sure. Campfires sprang up along the road where the Redcliffe caravan had settled in. It stretched a decent length, with soldiers, retainers, servants, wardens, nobles, a dwarven merchant and his son, and a single chantry scholar all joined together by their mutual destination, Denerim. The other two wardens had picked a campfire near the center to set up court. Finian could be seen there now, surrounded by rapt soldiers and civilians alike as he recounted the tale of an arduous journey into a dragon's nest. Percy personally doubted about half the heroic feats the elf claimed of his fellow wardens, but he couldn't begrudge the lot a certain amount of entertainment. Garrot and Okaren seemed to be having a good time of it anyway, the pair laughing and adding entertaining and ribald, respectively, comments to flavor the tale. Wyn, meanwhile, just stood to the side and shook her head fondly. Percy felt a smile tugging at his lips as he watched them at it. A part of him wanted to join them, but he couldn't. Not when there were more important matters to worry about. With a sigh, he turned and headed for the command tent, Hugo falling into step at his heels as always. He slipped through the flap quietly, entering into the candle-lit interior. The tent was round and large, and decorated with the arms of Redcliffe many times over. A collapsible wooden table dominated the center of the room, currently with a Ferelden map unfurled across it. The map was strewn with a number of wooden figures, each representing a known military contingent. Arleman pored over the map, stroking his beard in thought. A number of the Redcliffe leadership Tegan, 2 of his knights, etc. surrounded him. The dwarves should be sending forces out soon, Tegan said. Make her willing, they'll be able to handle the north shore of Lake Callanhood until the land's meat is settled. I'm more concerned about the Banorn, Eamon said. It's a mess at the moment, sir, one of the knights said. Ser Perth. The bands fight amongst themselves. We don't have the manpower to intervene. Warden Cousland. Percival straightened as the Jarl turned the tense attention to him. I am given to understand you have a number of allies at your call. We shall turn one of them to secure the Banorn, to rally our allies. Percival stiffened further, and not out of respect. Rage sparked deep in his stomach. How dare he? No. He couldn't lose control in front of these people. With all due respect, my lord, the forces we've called have been summoned under Grey Warden treaties, as they pertain to the Blight. And so they are. Turning the civil war in our favor will leave us better equipped to face the Darkspawn. They will not see it as such. He tried to imagine the dwarves fighting under Eamon's banner, but couldn't. Even worse, the Dalish. A silver-tongued rogue like you. Eamon said with a politician's smile. I'm sure you can make them see reason. It struck Percival that Eamon knew nothing about him, except what he'd been before Howe's betrayal. More, the Jarl knew nothing of the Blight. The civil war was a threat, but they could not spare the Warden's forces for it. That had been Kaelin's mistake, expecting the Wardens to be able to handle the Blight merely by their presence. That could not happen again. He drew himself straight, and allowed just a little of the ferocity that boiled within him to show. Whatever they saw in him, it gave Eamon pause. It is not negotiable, Percy said. The Warden's forces are needed for the Blight, and will not be needlessly depleted beforehand. Needlessly? Eamon said incredulously. We are fighting for your right to fight the Darkspawn, Warden. No, you are unseating a usurper. Percival looked around the tent, surprised that they were letting him get away with this. Eamon's sheer presence seemed to command a room too much to allow for blatant defiance. Unless, somehow Percy matched him. A strange thought. The land's meat is the best means of settling the bands, one way or another. You worry about that, Eamon. Let us worry about the Blight. Eamon considered him, his expression masked. Then, he smiled, and it was capitulation. You've grown up, he said softly, and that was as much as needed to be said. He turned back to the map. The others still stared at him, and it was stifling. Percival bowed briefly and then ducked out of the tent. He'd wanted to speak with the Jarl about his plans regarding the land's meat, but perhaps it was for the best that they leave one another to their respective problems. The land's meat was up to Eamon. Their problem was the hordes of Darkspawn that inhabited the land. He could feel the taint on the land around them, it was difficult to ignore. They were passing through a blight-ravaged area of Ferelden, where the passing of the horde was evident in every blackened stalk and dying tree. It grated on the nerves, like a shadow constantly at the edge of one's vision. Sometimes, he wondered whether the land would ever heal. He was no fit company tonight, so he avoided the campfire where his companions spoke and ate and laughed. Instead, he headed for the tent that had been designated for him. It was a perk, he supposed, of being the unspoken commander of the wardens. He was afforded his own relatively large tent and travel gear, as a matter of political symbolism. It was large enough to stand in, at least, with a camp chair alongside his bedroll. He had a bottle of spiced Orleans wine he'd brought from the Red Cliff cellars stashed among his things. He thought it was about time to break it open. He stopped right before entering as he realized that a candle was lit inside. Not Morrigan if she decided to surprise him, it was usually under cover of darkness, in the middle of the night. Someone else was waiting for him, he could see the figure's shadow flickering faintly against the tent walls. He glanced down, Hugo looked up at him curiously. His hound was not alarmed by the intruder, likely someone he knew, then. That may not have meant anything. All an assassin needed to do was feed the dog a juicy cut of meat, and they'd be best friends. Percy set his hand to the great sword at his back, then stepped inside. It was an assassin, but not the kind he had been expecting. Zevran lounged in his camp chair, swirling a glass of that same Orleans wine he had been thinking about a moment ago. Percival drew his hand from his pommel, but did not lower his guard. "What are you doing in my tent?" In his mood, it was more a growl than a question. The elf was unfazed. Careless of the fire curling in the berserker's stomach, the elf sipped his glass and hummed in pleasure. At last, he spoke. "Does the good Arl know you've been pilfering his cellar?" Percy narrowed his eyes. "Is that a threat, Antivan? If this is blackmail, you will know that I will not fall prey to it." The elf laughed, head thrown back. "Oh, not in the least. Perish the thought." He waved a dismissive hand, then leveled a pointed stare at him. "But tell me, Warden, is it not a bit early to be heading to bed? Why are you not spending time with your fellow wardens? I don't see how that concerns you. Are you tired? Or perhaps shy?" The assassin went on, swirling his glass. "Or could it be that you are avoiding a certain someone, say, 5 head tall, big brown eyes, and with a tongue so silver he could convince a dragon to roast its own eggs?" Percival froze. "I thought so." The elf smoothly bent to set the glass down by his feet. Then, he unfolded from the chair, all dangerous grace and dark eyes. "It seems, my friend, that we have run into a problem. My warden enjoys your company for whatever reason. I do not, but that is beside the point at the moment. You, on the other hand, avoid him as if he carries a deadly contagion. I do not understand Feraldans, is being admired so repulsive? He's a man. Your point being?" Zevran arched a brow, stalking in close. His voice lowered to a cold, smooth cadence that made Percival believe that this man was indeed a career killer. "If you are concerned that he may initiate unwanted contact, then you need not be. I will make him forget his silly little crush on you, be certain of that." It tickled a memory, and he realized that he'd seen this before. Before how, he'd had to face this sort of behavior several times, from paramours and friends of the ladies he'd entertained. Shocked, Percival breathed, "You're jealous." The Antivan's eyes narrowed. "I think not. Jealousy would indicate a threat, which you are not." Bravado. The elf was jealous. He couldn't help but bark an incredulous laugh. "You care about him? I'd never thought that a man could do that." He shook his head, amazed by the revelation that a man could care this way for another man. He'd never really considered it before. The elf seemed struck speechless. Perhaps he was as startled by the revelation as Percy was. Suddenly feeling more at ease about the whole business, Percy slipped past the elf and bent to pick up the glass of wine. He settled into the chair and studied it, wondering if the assassin had put anything in it that he should be worried about. Feeling strangely reckless, he lifted it to his lips and took a sip anyway. It was good wine, with a combination of sweet and spicy that the Orleans did not often indulge in. A lovely selection. By this time, the Antivan had recovered his composure. He watched the human with a closed expression, his arms crossed in front of him and his head tilted to one side. "So?" Percival started. "You're here to, what? Tell me to back off." The Antivan chuckled, but it was sharp and humorless. "On the contrary. I am here to tell you to stop being so skittish. He is very good with people, remember, he can tell when someone is avoiding him. Percival considered that. Better that than him detecting my discomfort, isn't it? Then I suggest you get over it. The Antivan moved to loom over it, still silky humor over steel. For whatever reason, he enjoys your company, and its lack is hurting him. Zevran leaned forward, the killer dark and cool in his eyes. I do not take kindly to anything that hurts him. Is that clear enough? Percival met Zevran's gaze for a long moment, trying to read the assassin's intent. Protectiveness. Jealousy. It seemed preposterous, but this man obviously had it bad for Finian to breathe. A man and a man, perhaps this sort of relationship wasn't some sort of abomination or sickness, if it was able to evoke something so pure from a career assassin? Percival nodded slowly. I will endeavor to put my discomfort aside, then. He is a very good friend. He offered the elf a small smile, as a matter of concession. Tell me, does he have any idea you're in my tent? The assassin relaxed with such suddenness that part of it had to be artifice. He stepped back and stretched. Not a one. And if he finds out you snuck into my tent in the middle of the night? The elf tilted his head, his lips curling into a lascivious smirk. He may be upset at first, but then we will merely have to invite him to join us. That would make his night, I suspect. Percy couldn't help but laugh, and that helped ease the discomfort he felt at the prospect. Really, if the elves had been women, he would have wholly agreed. He raised the glass of wine and toast, and Zevran plucked it out of his hands with a smirk. Then, the Antivan afforded the noble a graceful bow and left, carrying the glass out with him. Percival shook his head incredulously, leaning forward to rest his head on one hand. Were I he, a voice said abruptly behind him, and Percival just about jumped out of his chair in startlement, I would simply remove the offending party and have done with it. Maker, Morgan. Were you here the entire time? He looked over his shoulder, and saw her crawling out from under the sheet of his cot, where there had very much not been anything human-sized a moment before. 'Twas not my intention to lurk so, the witch said, fastidiously perching on his bed. But he came waltzing in as bold as you please. I saw no reason to alert him to my presence. You do realize that this is no more your tent than his? Percy pointed out, but there was no ire in it. She'd been sharing his bed for some time, now. He was in no position to protest if she felt comfortable in it. In fact, it was actually rather nice. She arched a brow. If I am unwelcome, then I shall leave. She made no move to stand, indicating that she had no illusions that such was the case. It was a dare, nothing more. Percy couldn't help crack a smile at that. Am I that predictable? Predictable would not be the word I would use. Consistent to certain priorities, perhaps. A woman's company being one of them. Percy leaned back in his seat. Once, that had been true, but it was no longer entirely accurate. Were some noble's daughter to crawl into his tent tomorrow, he would turn her about and march her straight back to her parents without giving it a second thought. He was just too exhausted by everything to turn on the charm like he'd used to. Except for Morgan. Which wasn't to say that he was particularly charming with her, she would only see such treatment as trite and shallow and would not tolerate it, and Percy couldn't say he blamed her. Rather, she was the exception to his apathy, the one who constantly stoked the fire just to see it burn. He found himself eyeing her. She had pulled her hair out of its clip, and now calmly ran a comb through the silky black strands cascading around her shoulders. She rarely let her hair loose, and the sight of her, sitting on his bed and making herself comfortable like she belonged there, made something in his chest twinge. You are very quiet, she said offhandedly. You'd rather I engaged you in the latest gossip. She rolled her eyes. Don't be dull. She patted the cot beside her with her comb, and Percival found himself standing, stepping across the tent, and sitting beside her. He even dared to lean in and sweep a stray lock of feather-soft hair from her shoulder. She returned to her brushing with no acknowledgement, but Percy nonetheless caught sight of a pleased quirk in her lips. We could speak of you instead, he offered. She scoffed. Why ever would you want to do that? Percy had to smother his laugh in her shoulder. What? Oh Maker, now she sounded cross. You are the strangest woman I have ever met. Did you know that? Am I? She sniffed. Forgive me if I do not trust your opinion of what is strange. You do let a mutt follow you everywhere, after all. You know, he actually likes you. Maker knows why, you're positively awful to him. But the same cannot be said for you. Interesting. Finally, she turned and fixed him with a piercing look. Tell me what you intend. He struggled to follow the shift in topic. You will have to be a bit more specific. She made a frustrated gesture. About your how, of course. This land's meet will be a gathering of nobles, correct? It stands to reason he will be there. Percy stiffened. Yes, How would certainly be in Denerim for the land's meet. Percival hadn't considered that. How could he have forgotten about How? He fought down the spark of fire in him before it had a chance to grow. There was more at stake here than his own vengeance. This was about the Blight, and his comrades, and even Arleman and their allies. None of it would wait for him to satisfy his own bloodlust. So, he took a breath and blew it out, then took another. Once he felt in control again, he said, "Nothing. Nothing. Not a thing." Her brow was arching like no brow had ever arched before, and he felt compelled to elaborate. "Our mission is to gather allies among the Ferelden nobility. We won't accomplish that if we start killing them." "I see. So you would let this man's crimes against you go unpunished?" Disdain was thick in her voice, and she abruptly swung her legs off the cot and stood. "I thought you stronger than that." And there it was. Her poking the fire. "I am being strong." She turned to regard him with arms crossed in a cool look. "And what about cowering behind the excuses of duty and missions like a scared little mouse makes you strong? Do you think this is easy, Morrigan?" He snapped, standing himself. On his feet, he towered over her slender form, but she showed no concern. "Do you think I don't want to go roaring into Amaranthin and start making men into corpses? That I don't yearn for the day when I will have that snake's blood on my hands? If that is what you desire, then why not pursue it? Exact upon him the price for his folly of crossing you. Simple, yes. No." She scoffed and turned to leave. "You truly have no idea, do you?" In his frustration, he just about picked up his camp chair and threw it at her. "You don't even try to understand." "Understand what, pray tell?" She turned to stand in the door, a stunning figure of thinning patience and rising ire. Self-restraint. Being sociable? Not giving in to base desires and killing everything that crosses you? You know, civilized behavior. If I fall short in that department, it is only because I have no will to understand it. This is not a weakness. Isn't it? He challenged. And when your lack of allies turns the tables on you, what will you do? You are saying you would not defend me, chivalrous knight that you are. She snapped back, voice thick with sarcasm. Not the point dash. 'Tis exactly the point. Just because I am more exacting about my allies does not mean I am incapable of making them. Her hands moved to her hips. This does not, however, mean that I will simper and fake smiles to every old man with a title, and I do not believe that you should either. I am not simpering. I am simply not cutting off their heads when they look at me sideways. And perhaps that is problem. If your politicians did the direct, honest thing and simply began stabbing one another instead of all this business of quitting battlefields, spreading lies, hiring assassins, and whatnot, then your wardens could have killed the archdemon by now. That shocked his rising temper right out of him. You really think that? She stamped a foot. Why do you always suspect me of dissembling? If I did not believe it, I would not say it. Her arms returned to their crossed position. You slew my mother, did you not? I dare say after her, the archdemon shall be positively redundant. And just like that, the fight went out of him. He slumped into the chair. They hadn't defeated Flemeth. Khazar had, which was to say that an abomination that had been Khazar had. And now he was defected, and dragging 3 of their wardens after him. Maker, how would they fight the archdemon if the others didn't come back? What do you want me to say, Morrigan? He asked tiredly. That I'll start lopping off the heads of all our enemies and ignore the consequences. I did not say that. Maker, could she be any more frustrating? Then perhaps my memory is faulty, because I'm pretty sure that is what you said. I did not say to necessarily resort to violence. I said that you should not simply do nothing. He peered up at her, more confused than anything. Then what are you proposing, exactly? She threw her hands in the air. How am I to know? You are the one with experience in navigating the spider's web that you call politics. All I care about is that you put up a fight. He was a little dumbfounded by that. Why do you care? She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out right away. Then, quickly, she said, it would reflect poorly upon me. A spark of amusement eased the exhaustion from the tug-of-war with Morgan. Is that so? I cannot very well have my companion rolling over and showing his belly every time another growls at him. What might that say about me, that I keep your company and counsel? Did you just compare me to a dog? 'Tis hardly the first time. You are rather canine in mannerisms. And that would make you your handler, of course. Of course. He hid a smile behind his hand, but a glance at her revealed that she was hardly fooled. Her mien bore the smug superiority that she always had when she managed such a feat as pulling a smile out of him. It seemed to be happening increasingly often. Between the arguing, anyway, but that was perhaps part of the excitement. I'll tell you what, Morgan. If I get the chance to somehow oppose Howe without putting the entire campaign at risk, I will take it. Of course you will, she said, as if they hadn't just had a huge fight about it. She walked to the bed and gracefully lowered herself to it. After a moment of looking at him across the tent, she snapped out an expectant, "Well? Are you going to sit over there all night?" And he chuckled and, like the dog she accused him of being, returned to the cot. He caught a glimpse of a pleased smile on her face before she waved a hand and magically snuffed the candle. 107 Going off-road. Tracking Khazar was child's play. The young man kept to the roads on the way to Orzammer, with any wolves or bears or other animals that dared to cross him left as charred corpses on the road as testament to his passage. Even Alistair stopped commenting on them after a while. Then, as they neared the base of the mountains, the trail veered west, off the road. Mila paused, peering curiously at the trail of upset scrub and footprints as it left the safety of the packed dirt. Fang ranged forward along the trail, only pausing as he noticed that they weren't following. The white wolf sat on the trail expectantly. We're stopping? Why are we stopping? Alistair asked. Mila nodded toward the wolf. The trail leaves the road here. Heading west. That's odd. Felicity said. She frowned thoughtfully. Might he be trying to throw us off? Leliana asked. Mila shook her head, glancing at Fang for confirmation. The wolf was definitely tracking his scent heading west. Unless his being an abomination somehow allows him to split himself into two, and then fly, no. He is headed west. Do you think he knows we're following him? Alistair asked. Jowan made a sound. With that pride demon, if he did, who knows whether he'd even care? Felicity nodded in agreement to that. She seemed to be turning something over in her head. If I recall correctly, geographically, that is the direction of Bonamar. Going through Orzammer is a more circuitous route, really. She froze and paled. Orzammer? Oh no, he's not going through Orzammer. She turned wide eyes to the rest of them. We're not going to have a chance to get lyrium. Silently, they all turned to look at Jowan, who shifted nervously under the attention. We're not sacrificing anyone, Alistair said sharply. He glanced toward Mila. She was inclined to agree, this time. She hated the idea of watching her Delethalan succumb to a demon, but she could not see the sacrifice of any of her fellow wardens, or even herself, as an equal trade. And the idea of Leliana being sacrificed, the very idea hurt her in a new, frightening way. It was a vulnerability that she was very aware of, bringing the singer into the deep roads as they were. Can we not take a detour to Orzammer? Leliana asked, sounding a bit hopeful. Mila wondered if perhaps the bard wanted to see the place. The elf had no such inclinations. It's a week out of the way, now, Felicity said. Khazar is taking a direct route. If we're going to have any chance of catching him, we have to do the same. But, Alistair said, how will he know where it is? How will he get in? He doesn't know of an entrance in that direction. Mila stepped off the road to follow the trail. Perhaps he intends to make one. In uneasy silence, the others followed behind. 108 Dwarf in the big city. As far as sprawling pens of trash and stink went, he'd thought Orzammer took the prize. But this Denerim place, damn. Just, damn. The humans were making a big to-do about their arrival. It was all arriving in force, this, and we're making a statement that Okaren couldn't be bothered to care. All he knew was that Arleman had the wardens walking into the city run by a guy who wanted to kill them. Gutsy move. Dumb, but gutsy. He approved. The wardens didn't seem bothered by being out in the open, anyway, not with how the elf and Braska joked as they walked down the street. Okaren was walking right behind them with the Cunary and the assassin. The old woman rode on one of the carts behind them, and who knew where the witch had gone? She disappeared like that from time to time. If Okaren had been able to change his shape, he'd be a flea riding on that one blonde maid's Fiein rack. Heh. It was kind of neat, anyway, how the crowd parted in front of them as they walked through the city. It had been a long time since Okaren had gotten that sort of reaction anywhere. Even if they weren't parting for him. Stone, it felt good to be respected again. Not that he'd let it go to his head or anything. Arleman and his hangers-on were in the lead, winding them through the crowd, past big blocky buildings and retaining walls, and alleys, and things that the dwarf didn't really have names for. That circular thing they passed, spouting water from the top? No idea what to call that, nor what the blazes it was used for. Last time we were here, the elf said to his fellow wardens, we had to sneak through the gates in disguise. It's strange just walking through the front door. It's like we're saying, hey, Loghain, we're home. What's for dinner? With all these fine specimens of warriorhood behind us, Garrot chuckled, who'd dare stop us? It appears they would, Sten spoke up, gazing at the path ahead. Okaren peeked around the side of the line to see why. Armed men watched them from all sides, coming out of the crannies and crevices of the city to surround them. None made a move to block their path, but it was obvious that these men saw them as intruders. Heh. This political thing might provide a bit of fun after all. The caravan kept moving, Arleman showing no concern about the hostile warriors that surrounded them. The caravan headed through a bustling square that even Okaren, in his limited surface experience, could tell was a thriving market. Across the way was a heavy portcullis that rose as they neared the estate, Okaren assumed. They were allowed inside, and the various merchants and civilians scattered to the far corners of the estate, but Eamon beckoned the wardens and company into the front hall. By calling the land's meet, I have struck the first blow. The advantage, for the moment, is ours. Eamon explained as the wardens and companions walked with him and Tegan to the front of the hall. His knights arrayed themselves around the large room, obviously wary. Loghain will have little choice but to show himself, to oppose us directly. That explained the armed men, then, didn't it? And where a nest of deep stalkers was, there was always a queen. Wouldn't be long before the bitch showed, most likely. Okaren settled himself in the back of the hall, leaning back against the wall with the Cunary on one side and the assassin on the other. All three of them would gladly jump in if things got out of hand. Judging by the way the elf picked at his nails with his dagger, he suspected they were every bit as eager to shed some blood as Okaren was. Sure enough, after a couple minutes to settle down, one of Eamon's men came running in, announcing that the regent had arrived. Let him in, Eamon said. He stepped forward, and Tegan and the three wardens arranged themselves behind him, the lot facing the door. This Loghain fellow made a show of it, entering with the righteous step of the wronged. Behind him marched a but-ugly man and a rather foxy lady, both armed and armored. They were ready for a fight. Let them try. Then, Okaren saw Percival's form tense like a pulled bow. Oh. Berserker trigger. That might make things messy. Loghain, Arleman greeted cordially. This is an honor, that the regent would find time to greet me personally. How could I not welcome a man so important as to call every lord in Ferelden away from his estate while a blight claws at our land? Loghain took on the same tone, but he wasn't nearly as good at it. Okar'en could hear the accusation underneath his civility. The blight is why I'm here, Eamon said. With Kaelin dead, Ferelden must have a king to lead it. Ferelden has a strong leader, Loghain snapped. Its queen. And I lead her armies. Oh joy. More throne-related bullshit. Almost made Okar'en homesick. Given your wish to concentrate on combating the blight, a smooth voice said, and Finian stepped forward, why, then, have you turned so much attention to eradicating us wardens? Surely, that energy is better served to work together with the Grey Wardens to defeat the blight. Loghain's eyes snapped to the elf disdainfully, but the elf's form didn't even flinch. I do not join with you wardens because you are the reason for Kaelin's demise. If you hadn't tricked him into believing that We did no such thing, Percival growled. He was definitely on the edge of his control. Something here was setting him off. Okar'en wished he could see the kid's face, to see what that thing was. Do not interrupt the Tern, snapped the woman at Loghain's shoulder. You are all fugitives, and will respect him for his mercy in allowing you temporary amnesty. It's quite all right, Ser Catherine, Loghain said. I expect nothing more from foreign spies. Spies? Is that what you think we are? Finian pressed. Rest assured, we were all born and raised in Ferelden, and want nothing better than to In our day, the man at Loghain's other side interrupted in a nasal drawl, elves knew not to speak in the presence of their betters. How times have changed. You've no right to speak of betters, how, Percival growled, spitting the name like a curse. That is Tern how to you. How sneered back, pup. Percival gave an animalistic snarl of rage, lunging at the older man. Okar'en burst forward to grip the kid before he did something stupid, and was grateful when Finian, Garrot, and Tegan all did the same. Hugo barked fiercely at the man, but Wyn and Zevran both grabbed his collar as he tried to lunge. Percival pulled against their grips as much as his dog did, glaring at How. You will pay for what you did to my family. Catherine had drawn her sword, but How was unperturbed. The bastard smirked, and Okar'en began to see why the kid hated him so much. What I did, child, is bring justice to a nest of traitors to the crown. Percival gave a wordless shout. For my services, the Regent has seen fit to grant me the Earlship of Denerim, after poor Urien's tragic demise at Ostagar, as well as the Terranship of Highever. Fitting, don't you think? I'll have your head. Percival roared, bucking against their hold. And damn if the kid didn't nearly manage to buck off the four of them, taking 2 murderous steps toward the man before they managed to stop him again. Okar'en could feel the rage flowing through the boy's veins. If they didn't put a stop to this soon, he'd start cutting off heads without looking to see whose heads he was cutting. You traitorous son of a bitch, I'll kill you. I swear on my father's grave. Sten swooped in from nowhere, easily picking up the thrashing berserker. Kausland was a big kid, but Sten was bigger, so he was able to bodily carry the raging berserker out of the hall. You're dead, How? The boy roared his rage as he disappeared. You're fucking dead. The dog whimpered and ran out after him. There was a moment of unsettled silence as the echoes of the young man's scream finished rebounding off the walls. Even Eamon's unflappable exterior had been flapped. You see what sort of men you've thrown your lot behind, Eamon, Loghain said, breaking the silence, yet you still defend them? There have been rumors that your illness has left you unfit. Illness? Eamon replied. Why not call your poison by its true name? Not everyone at the land's meet will cast aside their loyalties as easily as you and these sycophants. Catherine and How both made noises of protest, but Loghain silenced them with a wave. It is not wise to speak treason in this city. For anyone. He paced a step, then back. I had thought to talk you down from this rash course of action, Eamon. We must be united now, if we are to endure this crisis. Seems to me, Garrot rumbled, the one setting up walls is you. Hold your tongue, churl, Catherine snapped. Loghain ignored them, pointing an accusing finger at Eamon. You divide our nation and weaken our efforts against the blight with your selfish ambitions to the throne. Then stand with us, my lord, Finian implored. Together we can take out the archdemon, and then sort out these matters of state once the crisis is over. You expect me to put my faith in untried warden hands? After that, Loghain waved a hand at the hallway Percival had been dragged down. You wardens are menace enough by your very presence in my city without giving your madness any sort of sanction. We're not a threat. Finian's voice was getting harder. Even he was losing patience. We merely need to face the darkspawn without your men nipping at our heels. We can handle this threat without you, Loghain said. We don't need foreign hands dabbling in Ferelden business. Something in the elf snapped. With deadly cold, the elf said, is that what you told the Tevinter slavers you allowed in the alienage? That you didn't need their foreign help? Or doesn't money count as help? Beside Ocaran, Zevran froze, his head snapping up in alarm about something. In the middle of the room, Loghain had frozen in shock, and everyone else with him. It was an accusation completely out of left field, and to hear the smooth-talking, always amiable elf spit it out like that with menace and coldness that would have frozen magma. Ocaran wasn't surprised that everything stopped for a moment. How dare you, Loghain said, regaining his composure. Such a treasonous accusation. I should arrest you here and now. Bullshit, Finian snapped. Don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about. You sold Ferelden citizens into slavery to fund this civil war, Loghain, and I have proof. You lie. Frequently. But not this time. Finian's voice was a low, menacing growl. I'm done trying to reason with you, Loghain. I hope you've gotten your fix of vicarious power, because come the land's meet, we're taking you down one way or another. With that, the elf spun on his heels and stalked out of the room. Garrot gave a shrug and followed after him. Zevran followed, and Ocaran trailed after them, because he figured they should stand in solidarity about this. Or something. Or maybe it would just get boring now that the wardens were leaving. More likely that last one, actually. 109 Inspiration. As a bard, Leliana sought every experience for inspiration. Anything could be made into a song, or a story, be it a tragic battle, or a sweeping view, or merely a drop of water clinging to a blade of grass after the rain. There was beauty and inspiration everywhere. Or so she had thought. It was difficult to believe, with the weight of the earth stretching over their heads, and the stink of darkspawn around them. They had entered the deep roads that morning, going through a hole blown into the side of a mountain. Blown into the rock, the earth forced open by the power of the mage they followed. And then a tunnel down into the earth, all of it made by Khazar in his quest to his destination. It was frightening, to see that Khazar could tear through the earth with apparent ease. How could they hope to stop him? Then, an hour ago, Khazar's tunnel had broken through into a broad underground chamber, with high sweeping buttresses and solid worked stone walls. This, she realized, was a deep road. She could feel the history here. Perhaps that was where the inspiration lay, in the echoes that remained of the ancient dwarves. She understood, now, what Genitivy had meant about the heart of the dwarves being infused into their stonework. She could feel the strength they had once had, their industry. As they walked around rubble, she felt the ache of their eventual fall to the encroaching darkspawn. Depressing, isn't it? Felicity had sidled up beside her. She stared sadly up at the stonework. Once, the dwarves were a great nation, their reach extending far beyond the limits of men. Can you imagine walking these roads in their heyday? Passing caravans and settlements, all thriving and full of life in these vast halls. Leliana shook her head. It must have been grand. She dropped her attention downward, toward a woman who sought to reclaim a different lost civilization. Mila led the party, as usual, silently tracking Khazar through the dark tunnels. She had been silent and stiff ever since the earth swallowed them up. Her wolf had left them at the surface, refusing to follow them into the earth. It must have been difficult, losing that companionship when she was already unsettled, but Mila did not complain. She never did. Is it time to camp yet? Jowan said, lagging behind. We've been down here for hours. It's got to be nightfall soon. In the deep roads, Felicity said, such concepts have no meaning. Then how about the concept of, my feet are killing me, does that work? The rest of us have been walking all day too, Alistair said. He followed right behind Mila, but turned to walk backwards so he could look at Jowan. But you don't hear us whining about it, do you? That's not fair. I'm not as used to all this walking as you lot are. I spent the last month in a jail cell, remember? Oh, that's smart, Alistair snarked. Go to a secluded location, then remind everyone of the fact that you poisoned our Lehman, and that this whole mess is your fault. Weren't exactly top of your class, were you? Jowan went red. Alistair, Felicity chided, be nice. We should stop here, Mila said, coming back to join the rest of them. I can feel a large number of darkspawn ahead, apparently some sort of nest. We will need our energy to take them. The rest nodded, but Leliana was too concerned to agree. Mila did not often give much away, especially when she was feeling weak or afraid. But the fact that she was willing to slow their progress instead of pressing forward and dealing with the consequences, it was out of character. Enough to worry the bard. Mila led them into a side passage off the road, which ended in a small chamber. Here, they could curl up for the night without anything unsavory coming across them on accident. While the others started setting up a cold camp, they couldn't start a fire down here without the smoke drawing attention. Mila took a position standing at the entrance of the chamber, silently taking first watch. Carefully so as not to startle the elf, Leliana sidled up next to her. Not that she'd ever surprised the elf before. Mila's sense of her surroundings was uncommonly keen, but now in particular seemed a bad time to start. Mila was drawn as tight as a bowstring. Leliana laid a soft hand on the elf's upper arm. Mila, are you all right? The elf cast a glance at her, but then turned her eyes back to the tunnel. You must be careful, she said. If you come in contact with darkspawn blood, you may become tainted. Yes, I know, she said. Do you? Mila's eyes snapped back to her, stony and cold in a way they hadn't been in a while. Do you truly understand, Satisolan? It is an agonizing death, weakness and burning, and darkness that has nothing to do with lack of light. And we are venturing into the place where these creatures breed and live. She turned away, glaring out into the darkness down the tunnel. You should not have come with. Leliana felt a twist in her chest. Was she being rejected? Hurt, she said, if I've done something wrong, tell me. Mila's attention snapped back to her, stoniness gone for shock. What? No. That is not it at all. Oh. The feeling eased. Then, you are worried about me? A hesitation. Yes, the elf admitted. In my clan, it was part of my duty to protect my fellows. I have failed in allowing you to come with us to this dangerous position. I apologize. Leliana couldn't help but smile. Now she understood what was going on, and it was adorable. But I wanted to come. That is irrelevant. You have no point of reference to understand. Leliana stepped closer to her, and the elf trailed off. Leliana reached up to run a finger through the elf's hair. It was always a wild mess, but the beaded locks kept it in a semblance of order. Every bead had a story to it, a difficult hunt or a kill of some significance. Leliana had dared to ask about a couple of them, and had been fascinated to learn that Mila treasured their stories with all the reverence of a bard. It's very sweet, Leliana whispered, smiling, that you think of me like a member of your clan. Thank you. Mila averted her eyes. I simply do not wish you to come to any harm. The thought distresses me. It was a rare admittance, as good as a confession. Leliana leaned in to give the elf a fond peck on the lips, and was startled when Mila wrapped her arms around her and deepened the kiss. The Dalish elf was always so guarded that there was a little thrill in breaking through all that stone. Leliana sank into the kiss, wrapping her arms around the elf's slender shoulders, reveling in the protectiveness she felt in the other woman's grip. Mila's kiss was as intense as the rest of the elf, her mouth moving against Leliana's with focus and purpose, and Leliana had to fight back a giggle at the thought that the elf probably didn't even know what that purpose was. Mila simply threw her entire being into things. It was one of the things the Orlshian adored about her. I see that your statement in Redcliffe was legitimate. Is that magi talk, for I was right? It's not magi talk, Jowan said. It's Felicity talk. None of the rest of us ever speak like that, trust me. Mila pulled back, a bright shade of red on her stoic features. Leliana giggled at the sight. Softly, so that only Mila's sharp ears would hear, she whispered, "You don't have to be embarrassed. I am unaccustomed to this sort of attention." Mila bowed her head. "I apologize." It was so cute that Leliana just had to reach in and kiss her again. They soon forgot about the others, and the press of stone overhead. 110 Meeting and greeting. It took some time, and a lot of coaxing from the elf, and being physically sat on by a cunary and a mulberry, but they finally managed to bring the captain down from his screaming, frothing rage. Good thing, too, because for a minute there, the pretty boy had been screaming that he was going to kill them all. If Garrot hadn't had such a tough skin, he might have taken that personal, you know? Now, the guy lay on a bed in one of the guest rooms, still playing couch to the cunary and dog. Percival's hands covered his face. A softer man might have started weeping, but the captain hadn't been soft in a long time. The elf didn't seem fit to smooth things out anyway. He still had that anger simmering under the surface, and if Finian was having difficulty masking it, it must have been a doozy. Garrot had heard snippets about what had happened, with How and the alienage and whatnot, but he hadn't guessed it would affect them both so deeply. Ah well. So Garrot was the level-headed one. He could swing that. He grabbed something off Okaren's belt, making the old man grunt. Then, he hopped up onto the crowded bed, planting himself right next to the boss's head. When the captain lowered his hands to look at him, Garrot silently plunked Okaren's waterskin next to the man's ear. The human's hands shook, but he took it without protest, taking a nice long drag of whatever the old man had inside it today. Once he'd had his drink, Garrot took the skin and capped it, then tossed it back to Okaren. "Thank you. I'm all right now." He glanced down at his captors pointedly. Sten and Hugo lifted off him, but Garrot stayed put. Percival sat up, rubbing at his face. "So that was the guy who offed your parents, eh?" Garrot asked. "My parents. My nephew. All the knights, and servants, and guests, and anyone who ever had any ties to the Kaus land line." Percival grit his teeth. "Yes. That was him. I suppose having a bear bite his head off is out of the question." Morrigan's voice drawled. She hovered in the doorway, having appeared from who knew where. "Are you offering?" Percival said. "Because if you are, I may just say yes." "We can't kill him," Finn said, though Garrot caught the slight tremble in his voice. "Neither of them. If either dies now, or even goes missing, it'll count against us at the land's meet. They'll think we're trying to silence competition. We can't touch them." "More's the pity," Zevran agreed. "But the dagger cuts both ways, eh?" Garrot said. "We can't touch them, but they can't touch us either. What do ya say we go find a tavern and flaunt our presence right under those nughumpers' noses?" That drew smirks all around. "I could certainly go for a drink," Percival said, his expression lightening. He rolled off the bed, and Garrot hopped off after him. The dwarf couldn't help but notice that the noble secured his old high-ever shield across his back, for all to see, even though doing so inhibited his ability to draw his great sword. In this case, the shield was the weapon. Percival may not have liked the games of nobility, but damned if he didn't know how to play. "The Nod Noble is nearby," Finian supplied as they started filing out. "If we want to flaunt our presence in front of a bunch of hostile nobles, that will be the place." They didn't precisely sneak out of the estate, but they didn't go out through the front door either, and no one suggested that they go find Wynne to invite her. They wound through the library and slipped out a side entrance, then passed through the courtyard into the marketplace. The square was packed tight, rivaling the Commons district of Orzammer in its bustle. Garrot would have bet his nose that it rivaled Orzammer in seediness, too. There were plenty of thieves winding their way through the crowd. He could well imagine the elf being one of them, back in the day, and plenty of guards to look the other way. Then, there was an exaggerated gasp across the square. "By the Maker! Percy!" A voice squealed, and the captain stopped dead in his tracks. A girl shoved her way through the crowd, dressed in a bright silk dress and trailed by a pair of tired-looking guards. "Percy! It is you!" She launched herself at the armored man, squealing in delight. Once she had attached herself, She bounced excitedly. I heard about what happened at Ostagar, but I didn't believe it. You're such a rebel, standing up to Loghain. Garrod had difficulty stifling his sniggers. Judging by the way Zevran looked aside and the tight press of Finn's lips, he wasn't the only one. Percival shrugged off the girl's grip. Haberin, he said stiffly. She deflated a bit. You don't still think I'm too young, do you, Percy? Because I turned 15 just this last week and dash. It's not that, Lady Haberin. His voice smoothed out, and Garrod caught a glimpse of the smooth-talking lady killer the man had once been. I've merely got other things on my mind. Get back to your shopping. She pouted. This girl was 15. If there was a maker, then by the stone had he gifted her. Wow. Oh, I know. A Grey Warden, you must be so good with a sword. Are you going to save us from the blight? The girl was relentless, but Percival gently moved her back. I will try. For now, I have warden business to attend to. Sure, if business meant getting completely hanged at the tavern. I will speak with you later, when I do not. Oh. The girl pouted, but relented. Then, she twirled her hair and swayed her hips in a way that was like a satire of flirt. All right. I'll see you around, Percy. It was nice to see you, Lady Haberin. The wardens moved past the girl and her two now amused guards. Garrod managed to hold in his own amusement until they were out of the girl's hearing range. Then, he, Ocaran, and the elves all burst out in laughter. Way to go, kid. Ocaran crowed. Why'd you turn ER down? The rack on that girl, that's worth all the clinginess in the world right there. Percival gave them a wry look. I've known her since she was 4. She follows me around incessantly, and I'll give that she's always been pretty, but she's simply so young. I think Lord Bryland always wanted my father to consider her as a viable match for me, so kept seeing that we were put together at social events. He made a face. Your father didn't approve? Finian asked diplomatically. Why not? Her age. I bet, Garrod put in, that he was such a troublemaker that his daddy didn't want to inflict him on some poor unsuspecting girl. No and no. Percival sighed. If you must know, I was somewhat intended for another. And who might that be? Morrigan asked with silky calm. Delilah Howe. His voice dropped to a whisper. Obviously, that can never happen now. Related to the Arl? Finn asked. His daughter. But, she can't have anything to do with his betrayal, can she? I don't know, Finn. This stirred some reaction from the guy, at least. I have no way of knowing how deep that bastard's blood flows. It could taint Delilah, or Thomas, or Nate, or any one of that snake's family. Maybe all of them. All I know is that I will never pass a day in the presence of any Howe without wondering whether and when they were going to shove a dagger into my back. He took a breath, letting it out in a harsh sigh. It doesn't matter. I wouldn't want to marry any noble girls, anyway, even if they weren't connected to Howe. That whole world. I'm beyond it, and I refuse to return. Even so, he adjusted the set of the high-ever shield on his back, and walked them toward the tavern. Garrod cast a curious eye back at the witch as they walked. Everyone knew that she and the captain had been doing the horizontal proving on a regular basis. Alas, the woman's face was a mask. Always an enigma, was Morgan. Suddenly, Ocaran brayed out a laugh beside him. Well, I'll be a nug-humping son of a duster. Is that who I think it is? The elder dwarf took off at a strut toward one of the merchant stalls. Beside it, a dwarven man stood hawking weapons and metal tools. The dwarf looked up at the old man's shout, staring for a moment. Then, recognition flicked across his features, followed by mixed surprise and amusement. Ocaran. Well, I'll be damned. Did they finally kick you out of Orzammer? The man spoke with surprising diction for a weapons merchant. Garrod trailed after the old man, curious. Nah. Finally found someone to take my drunken ass to Branka. Semir kid. I wanna introduce you. Ocaran beckoned him over, and Garrod obligingly stepped up next to the old man. The merchant's eyes flickered to his tattoo, and then away, as if recalling that being a duster didn't mean squat up here. This here's Garrot Braska, Grey Warden, trap maker, and babysitter of old washed-up warriors. He slapped Garrot's back fondly. You should see what the kid did to the roads around Orzammer. Made the tunnels into a dark spawn death trap. The merchant's eyes brightened at the mention of him being a warden. Ah, yes. I'd heard about you. You're the one that snuck into the proving, right? Garrot nodded slowly. You from Orzammer, then? That I am, yes. This here's Gorim, Okaren provided. He leaned forward. He was Marnin's right-hand warrior, until they booted both of them out. The merchant's face broadened into a smile. You know Marnin? That must mean she made it out of the deep roads. Yeah. Suddenly, Garrot's chest felt tight. This guy had known the princess. It dug up a fresh grave. Well, kinda. The merchant read his expression, his elation fading. What happened? Why isn't she here with you? She died. Got her out of the deep roads, to Ostagar. She became kind of a general to what remained of us. She was a good girl. Good head on her, you know. Gorim nodded wistfully. That I do. Thing is, we had to go into the deep roads on warden business. She fought a good fight, went down protectin' the rest of us. How she woulda wanted to go. Gorim nodded sadly. That is exactly how she would have wanted to. All honor and courage to her memory. Yeah. They shared a moment of silence. Then, the merchant sighed. Well, Warden. It was nice to meet you. Thank you for the news. He held out a hand, and Garrot shook it solidly. No problem. Garrot and Okaren pulled away from the merchant, only to find that the others had moved on without them. The tavern was right there anyway, so they trundled through the doorway with no problem. The Nod Noble was packed with tall people, but the sounds and smells of people getting drunk were universal, so Garrot didn't feel any discomfort. Okaren took a deep breath as soon as they stepped inside, and Garrot shoved him forward with a laughing, "Keep moving, old man." The other wardens were pretty easy to spot, what with the cunnery and the gigantic dog and the obvious apostate that colored their group. They had settled into and around a booth near the front of the tavern, with a pretty waitress already taking their orders. Garrot climbed up into the booth next to Finn, and Okaren scooted in after him. Percy and Sten sat opposite them, the latter stiff and obviously uncomfortable. The sight drew a chuckle from Garrot. Morrigan leaned against one side of the booth, and Zevran against the other. Both of them were leaking discomfort all over the place. Morrigan because civilization confused her, and Zevran, well, maybe the assassin expected something the rest of them didn't. His lines were all tight and ready for action. It was hard to say. Garrot didn't know him well enough to judge. Garrot added his order to the others, anything but like an ale, and the waitress left. Finian leaned back in the corner of the booth, grinning. You can't imagine how much this tickles me. Used to be, I was always glared at if I even got near the door of this place. Now, no one can stop staring. Garrot glanced around. Sure enough, eyes were trained on their table all around the room, no wonder the assassin was jumpy. The bouncer watched them, and the barkeeper, and a number of fancily dressed patrons. Garrot was used to this sort of thing, so he hadn't even realized. "'Tis more likely," Morrigan drawled, "that their stares have more to do with your company than with any change in status on your own part." "Well, yeah. Most likely. It's not often that a cunnery walks into the Nod Noble." The elf grinned. "Still pretty funny, though." "I get that," Garrot chuckled. "Same happened to me when I returned to Orzammer. Used to be it was all, get outta our sight, duster. Then you go grey and suddenly they're pardon before you and giving ya free drinks." "Wait," Okaren said. "Wardens get free drinks? Why didn't anyone tell me?" Garrot snorted. "Like you need it, old man. Hey, habits like mine get expensive. What I gotta do to join the club, huh?" Percival shook his head. "Somehow, I suspect it's a bit more than you're willing to take for the occasional free drink. You'd be surprised, Goldie." "Pardon me." The conversation paused as someone moved to stand over their table. It was a well-dressed man with a neatly trimmed beard. "You're Bryce and Eleanor's younger son, are you not?" The captain took a moment to study the stranger. I am Bansired, right? The man nodded. I had heard about what happened to your household. You have my deepest sympathies. You do not believe the reports about my father's being a traitor, my lord. The Ban cast a quick glance over his shoulder, toward a table where a well-dressed man conversed with a woman in leather armor. I find it difficult to believe, all things considered. The man returned his attention to Percival. People who question the official reports have a habit of disappearing, including my son. You haven't seen him. Percival shook his head. If I do, you will be the first to know. The Ban nodded, deflating. Even so. It is good to finally have this whole mess near a conclusion. Percival nodded. We shall see you at the land's meet, my lord. Good luck in your search. The Ban nodded and returned to his fellows. That poor man, Finn said softly. Do you think we have time to help him search? It will take a while for all the nobles to file in, Percival said. However, I do not think that interfering any more than we already have would be wise. Or perhaps T would be most wise, Morgan said. Certainly, if you found his missing son, he would owe you a debt of gratitude. He would have no choice but to throw his support for you. Garrot snorted. It wasn't pretty, but it was a good point. You think any of the other nobles have any conveniently missing kids? Percival bowed his head and rubbed his eyes. I'm not sure whether to be horrified by these suggestions or grateful for them. Grateful, obviously, Morgan said. The waitress returned with their drinks, carefully setting each in front of them, and handing the Antivan his brandy. Then, she pulled a piece of parchment off the tray and set it in front of Garrot. Man at the bar said to give this to you. Garrot was immediately suspicious, and he could tell that the others were too. He picked up the thing, doing a quick check over for contact poison or some other nasty trick. Hard to pull off with a piece of paper, sure, but doable. Satisfied, Garrot unfolded it, and the other two wardens leaned in to read with him. We couldn't help but overhear, and the answer to your question just now is yes. Come to the guest rooms to learn more. First door. What question? The one about whether any nobles had missing kids? Garrot arched a brow. How did he even? Percival shook his head. I don't like this. Why wouldn't this person come to us directly? But if it's true, Finn whispered, settling back into the booth. We need all the support we can get, Percy. Agreed, Garrot said. It's worth a try, anyway. And if it's a trap, well, we've been through worse. Percival pursed his lips, but nodded. All right. All going. Better not. Garrot leaned over and dangled the note over the nearest candle, burning the thing to ash. Things like this, it's best to be discreet. Come on, elf. He and Finian clambered out of the booth, and Zevran fell into step behind them. Damn, Antivan was looking straight up twitchy, now. Eyes darting everywhere, fingers flexing. Garrot was beginning to wonder whether he'd maybe gotten hit on his head at some point or something. Hugo. Guard, the captain said. The Maberry obediently padded after them, and Garrot shuddered. Stone, he hated that dog. The three of them slipped into the back hall, passing through the crowded tavern with much more ease than they'd have been able to if one of their flashier companions had come along. The three of them all knew a thing or two about blending in for nefarious purposes, after all. They knocked on the door, and a smooth voice inside told them to come in. Garrot was half expecting an arrow to the face as soon as he stepped through, but none was forthcoming. In fact, the handful of men inside were pointedly relaxed, their hands all in full view and removed from their weapons. An underworld armistice. That did not stop the Antivan elf, though. Zevran hissed an Antivan curse, his weapons smoothly leaving their sheaths. I knew it. What game are you playing, Ignacio? Put your toys away, Horson, a willowy man at the back of the room said, his voice a smooth and cold Antivan accent. Ah. We are not here for you. The man turned his attention to the wardens. I thank you for accepting my invitation. If you've truly a wish to gain the favor of the Ferelden nobility, we have an offer that may prove mutually beneficial. Finian stepped in front of Zevran, who, Garrot noted, had not put his weapons away, his posture switching to that friendly/non-threatening one he took on when he was getting ready to charm the scales off the snake. "Certainly, you understand if we are suspicious. How do we know this isn't merely a trap to capture a stray crow? Because it is not my job to track down a deserting son of a whore. That is the designation of Taliesin. To the rest of us, he is as good as dead." He paused, studying them with narrowed eyes. "If you doubt my words, ask the ghost yourself." Finn cast a glance back at Zevran, who nodded hesitantly. Slowly, his blades returned to their sheaths. "Now that silliness is behind us, perhaps we may discuss business, no? And what kind of business are we referring to?" Garrot snorted a laugh, because that answer was obvious to all of them. "You must realize," Finian continued, "that any poor fortune among the nobility would immediately be suspect at this late hour. We cannot afford to wish any of them wrong. Of course. Such things would certainly be unfortunate. We need not even consider such things." The crow leaned back against the wall, every line of his body reading unconcern. "You see, I am in the business of information. There are bad men in the world. Bad men who kidnap good men's children. Sometimes, those good men come to me, and ask me to write down the bad men's names. I put the names in a box, and if someone takes those names, they might read them. And if they come back later, and tell me that something has happened to the bad men whose names they read, that they've had an accident or some such, I pay them for the trouble. It is simple, no?" Garrot couldn't help it, he laughed. "Prince's balls." The Cardo was never this pointlessly vague. "One can never be too careful," the crow said. "You have always been a clever snake, Ignacio," Zevran said sharply. "What's the catch? Why are you seeking outside help on a crow contract? You are currently dead to me, Horson," the crow spat back. "Pray I do not learn otherwise." "Then I will ask the question," Finian cut in with forced calm. "Why do you seek our help? If we gain the support of the Father, what do you gain? Any questions that must be answered will be in time. All others are irrelevant." Garrot crossed his arms. "So which one is that one?" "That remains to be seen." Ignacio eyed them both. "So, are you interested in my little chest, and the names within? Or shall I take my business elsewhere?" Garrot exchanged a look with Finian. The elf was as torn as he was. Finn asked, "And you say this good man is a noble who will be at the land's meet?" "Which one?" "Alas, that is a name I cannot write down." "Understandable," Garrot said. He didn't have a problem executing a hit, especially if there was a kidnapped kid involved. Still, working for the people who had once sent a guy to kill them, well, it was a risk. Garrot tossed a glance back at Zevran. "What d'ya say, elf? Can we trust him?" Zevran was still stiff and tense, but he nodded slowly. "If it is as he says, and Taliesin has taken up the contract against me." He hit a wince. Apparently, something about that hit a nerve. "Then yes. The crows would have no reason to lie to us." "To you?" Finian nodded. "All right, Ignacio. We might be interested in seeing those names. Check the description for the links to the author."